and a huge welcome from all of us here at Consilium, as well as from our sponsors Citi, Cooley and Stiefel, to our 10th annual healthcare conference. I still can't quite believe it's been 10 years. I'm Amber Fennell. I'm partner and co-founder of Consilium Strategic Communications, and we are so delighted to have you all here with us today. Welcome also to the people on the webcast. We have a webcast running, everything is recorded, which has kindly been sponsored by LSE Spark. So, why are we here? Well, right from the start, about 10 years ago, we created this conference to kind of help make sense of the key trends shaping our industry, to help us all get a bit of perspective and consider what has happened over the last year. Tease out some learnings and observations that we can take forward into the year ahead. And with the intensity of the past year, this roller coaster that we are all on at the moment, this reflection is kind of needed more than ever. There is a lot of doom and gloom at the moment, and no doubt on your way here you were bombarded with lots of negative news stories and narrative that makes you think that we're in a tough place. But I very much hope that today will change that perspective. We all are working in the most incredible, robust and highly innovative, uniquely adaptable sector that's still working away despite all the problems in the world. Innovation is rife, progress is finding a way. Incredible science is happening. Healthcare companies are being formed, sold, adapted, changed, and most of all, they're thriving. And it is our great pleasure at Consilium to help support this, to ensure that great stories get told and that innovation and progress gets remembered. Our team is continuing to grow. There's a lot of new faces that you'll see today. They're all wearing purple lanyards, so if you have time, please do introduce yourself and say hello. And so, to our agenda. In our first panel, we're going to be looking at innovation bubbles in our sector. How they come about, why, and are they a help or a hindrance to healthcare innovation? We're going to also spend some cerebral time reimagining healthcare, and despite obviously the roller coaster of current markets, what needs to happen to create the healthcare of the future? You've asked us for an extra long networking break, so we have responded. So we have 45 minutes over here. It was getting a bit busy. We do have also a room downstairs as well if you want to head there for a bit of a quieter chat. We're then, after the break, going to dive in, how do we fund all this incredible innovation? And Nick Moore from Stiefel will be guiding us through that with a panel of CFOs, investors, and people who have done deals over the last year. And then we're going to finish it all off with a very extra special fireside chat. The incredible Justin Stebbing will be here with us, with Hannah Kutcher from the FT. Justin wears many hats. He's a treating oncologist to an investor, editor of Oncogene to a research scientist, having been published in over 700 peer-reviewed journals. So we're super excited to hear his learnings over his career. We also, if you can stay with us until 5, we'll have drinks here as well, so hopefully you can stick around and join us. Last but not least, a bit of housekeeping. You'll see up here we have a slightly different way of doing things with using Slido to ask questions. So you can ask questions throughout the sessions. You don't have to wait for a mic or wait till the end. All you have to do is go to the Slido website, punch in the entry, the code, and then you'll be able to ask your questions. The unique thing about this platform, it allows you to vote up other people's questions. So if your neighbour's more intelligent than you can vote them up if you want to. If you prefer the old-fashioned way, we also do have a roving mic. So Kamal in our team will be running around with a mic, and you can also just jump in and interject. Thank you again for being with us today. To all our sponsors, all our clients, and the incredible team here at Consilium, it's an honour to support this inspiring industry. And let me introduce, therefore, our first panel. Bursting the bubbles, our hot therapeutic areas of investor focus are help or hindrance to innovation. And that's going to be moderated by partner at Cooley, Nicola Maguire, Ros Deegan, Chief Executive Officer of OMAS Therapeutics, Nick Kerr, who is CFO of Benevolent AI, Lyndon Thompson, Fund Manager from AXA, and Lars Wild, Chief Executive Officer of Pangaea Botanica. Please join us. Have a great day, everyone.
To our first panel. So as Amber said, the first panel, our title is Bursting the Bubble. And I think over the years, we've all seen various therapeutic areas come and go, come in, and everybody wants to invest in them and then fall out of favor. So for example, like gene therapy, that was seen as having enormous potential, but then the difficulties of marketing that sort of product became more evident, and it sort of fell out of favor. Similarly, dementia is has been a very hot topic recently, and then it's been more apparent recently with the role of beta amyloid plaques that this makes it more difficult to market those sorts of therapies. So we're going to talk this afternoon a bit about whether therapeutic areas of investor focus are a help or whether they're a hindrance. So I'd like to start off by, if each of the panel can just sort of say a little bit about themselves and their background, and then we'll move on to the questions. So Lars?
Yeah, very nice to meet you all. I'm Lars. I'm a biotech CEO and co-founder of a company called Pangaea Botanica, which is a very recent company developing nature-inspired molecules for difficult-to-treat indication areas. Before that, I built two biotech companies in the serotonergic psychedelic therapeutic space called Compass Pathways and Atai Life Sciences that have seen a lot of interest over the last 5 years, a lot of capital flow into R&D. Both companies together have raised 1.4 billion, and now we're obviously seeing the market situations at the moment, which we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. So nice to meet you all. My name is Nick Kerr. I'm the CFO of Benevolent AI. Benevolent is a AI-enabled drug discovery company with assets in the clinic and with a specific focus on target IED. Prior to Benevolent AI, I was the CFO of Clinigen, and prior to that, actually had a life in banking as well.
Hello everyone, I'm Ros Deegan. I'm CEO of OMAS Therapeutics. We're an early stage discovery company going after undruggable targets using our technology platform. Before that, I spent 13 years in the US, so I actually came back from Boston for this opportunity. I'm a returnee, and I was a chief business officer, and I set up the US subsidiary for Bicycle Therapeutics. And before that, I was at a US-focused biotech company called Trevena. I'm also in a family of football supporters, so I would say, even though I'm not really a West Ham supporter, their song is I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles. And I think as a CEO, I do more blowing than bursting personally.
I'm Lyndon Thompson. I've been investing in biotech for 20 years on the sell side in a hedge fund, and then for the last 10, I've been running the biotech fund at AXA Investment Managers.
Thank you. So let's start setting the scene. So maybe can you sort of comment on whether you've been or you're currently benefiting from a bubble or being harmed by a bubble? Maybe Ros, do you want to start?
I would never say that we're working in a bubble. So I would say that there are areas that are hot at a particular time, and if that is what I would call heat that has justice and longevity, then I'll follow it. So, for example, we are working on a particularly exciting target, Gasdermin D. It's in the inflammasome, which I think is a hot area. I think there's justification for that, and there's clinical data certainly for canakinumab suggesting that if you block inflammasome activation, you can have efficacy in a number of different diseases. But the challenge with bubbles is often it's difficult to differentiate, and we are going after undruggable targets. So in our case, we get the best of both worlds because we can work on hot areas, but without competition, because we're the only people, we believe, who can sometimes drug these targets, and certainly for Gasdermin D, we've been successful where others have failed. But I will comment on the bad side of bubbles, because I won't say when in my career, but I actually did take a deal all the way to not just the contract, but actually a fully agreed press release, only for it to be pulled because that particular bubble burst just before the agreement crossed somebody's desk to sign. So that's the bad side, the downside of sometimes working in a bubble.
Lind?
Well, I think I'm on the other side of this. I'm probably partly responsible, I guess people might say. So, when I look at this, I struggle really to think that there are many bubbles. There are certainly areas of therapeutic interest, and a lot of that is scientifically validated and or good opportunities from a commercial perspective. So, if I think about where there's hotter areas right now, we're looking at Alzheimer's, no question. Neurodegeneration is an area that investors have started to look at again. And, if you saw the FDA approval of aducanumab, there was a lot of controversy about that, obviously, but one of the key parts of that was that the FDA gave an indication that they'll be able to use biomarkers for approvals. And I think that opened up a lot of doors for earlier stage companies to be able to, progress drugs in development in neurodegeneration further than they otherwise would. If I could be controversial at the start, I think one of the hotter areas that is going to come into some trouble in the near term from an investor point of view is small molecule targeted oncology, which has been for a very long time an area that investors really like. But with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, large cap execs are already talking about the 9 years versus 13-year difference, and investors are already looking at, is that something that we need to think about from a long-term valuation call?
And Nick, certainly AI has been sort of in the news for quite a while now. How's that affected Benevolent?
Yeah, and I think it's important, first of all, to kind of step back and realise that perhaps globally we've been acting in something of a bubble for quite some time, with interest rates being artificially low and printing presses of money and whatnot. And certainly I wouldn't say anybody's in a bubble today, given the pressures we've seen in equity markets as well. And looking specifically at AI, I think it's not necessarily a bubble. I would actually see it more as three trends coming together, coalescing in terms of growth of biomedical research, AI machine learning capability, and computational, benefits of computational growth, essentially, in terms of machine power, all coming together at the same time. So it's less about the bubble, essentially, at the moment of the industry, but it's actually more about just progression and how it's actually evolving from it. Now, clearly, we've not been immune from everybody's share price and valuations being hit as well, which has been very disappointing for the whole sector. But what we're seeing is continued investment and focus in the space and more big pharma collaborations. So if this is a bubble deflating, I think it's about to just take a pause before it goes back out again. Because this is actually just how big pharma are adopting this technology steadily, but it's increasing at pace as well. So it's more of a shift change in essentially how we do R&D within the industry.
And Lars, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think maybe on a high level, what we call a bubble or an increase in demand for any given therapeutic area is probably a driver of innovation as well, because it facilitates fields to develop. So if I look concretely at what we have done over the past 6 years, when we started the two companies that I was speaking about earlier, and we mentioned that we would be using a psychedelic therapy to treat someone who already has a mental health disorder, the obvious question was, why would you want to make matters worse? Obviously, we believed we could make matters better. And we saw that we could really drive capital into that field. And that enabled us to move a very promising therapeutics, obviously, into late-stage phase 3 clinical trials and hopefully soon to approval, where I believe that's great. What are the downside measures that you need to take when you know that you're in a very hot field, and how do you identify a very hot field? I would say we saw a lot of unusual capital inflows. So we saw a lot of interest from generalist hedge funds, technology funds, etc., that during the COVID years went into bio at large and very specifically into these hot new areas, including AI, for example. And eventually, when we moved into a post-COVID world, we saw these capital flows leave these asset classes, again, orienting themselves more into other areas such as consumer. And so I think the companies that will thrive are the ones that were prepared for that to happen, meaning that you had enough cash on the balance sheet to weather the storm. And I agree with Nick, right? I think we're seeing obviously ever larger funds being raised on the private side in bio. We see that the balance sheets of the big pharma companies have never looked healthier. So at a 5-year level, we're probably going into one of the most interesting cycles in bio, I would say. So it's all about measuring that exuberance and going through Gartner's hype cycle, really, and coming out on the other side healthy.
So that sort of moves us on to sort of another area I just wanted to explore, which was about what sort of causes a bubble. And you sort of mentioned there pharma companies focusing on a particular area, or is it investors wanting to invest in a particular area? How does a bubble sort of start and build?
There's many different ways, but thinking about what mechanisms make sense, have they been validated or not? And you can say validation through clinical trials. You can say that that's where the pharma kind of angle comes in. If you just look at the moment, obesity is one that you could focus on. For 15 years, it's been a struggle. We had a bubble, what would have been 15 or 20 years ago in the sector, that proved itself commercially not to work itself out. And now you've got Lilly and Novo reporting, data for some of their diabetes drugs in obesity. And what you have next is large sell-side houses with titles on their research saying the next $100 billion opportunity. So those are the kind of ways that it works. But I would say that often they're based on, very rigorous science and commercial opportunity that people and investors can see. And one of the things I would also say is it's often disruptive therapies that tend to move into these categories, these hotter categories like gene therapy you mentioned. And my experience over the longer term is that those disruptors tend not to be as disruptive as you initially think in the long term.
Is there any other thoughts, Nick?
I'd add to that. It's the bubble. I don't think bubbles are good things, actually. What you prefer is actually quite slow, steady progression and making things better over time. But in terms of those disruptive technologies that are coming through, if you think about it just from the AI side in pharma R&D, you need to have capabilities everywhere. Essentially, the big pharma also need to be able to adopt it, integrate it, understand it. Investors also need to be able to understand the area before they kind of give it the benefit of the doubt, because when these kind of industries are burgeoning, coming from a position of not being aligned to pharma at all, like AI, so when they coalesce, people don't understand it. So how do you explain it and sell it internally to a pharma company unless they have that capability in-house as well? So these trends can take a long time to build, but we've seen recently that the big pharma companies are investing heavily internally to develop their own capabilities, but they won't be able to do all of it. And then they're going to look to kind of partner out as well. So there is that kind of, these bubbles can take I hate the word bubble, but if these trends essentially, hot areas, thank you. If they kind of take time to kind of build, and there'll be cooling off periods, as we're kind of seeing at the moment in terms of the market sector, but it will come back again as capabilities are now building on both sides, so these deals will kind of quicken. And on the investor side as well, the more companies you have in that space, the more people that have to take a view, essentially, because Lyndon will tell you, if you don't have a view in that space, then you could miss out and your performance may not be as good because somebody else has taken the view and it's worked out. So it's kind of that interest just builds slowly over time, but it needs to build everywhere. That's why it's really important that we have those capabilities, not just in the investors on the buy side, also on the sell side to help explain it, and also in the pharma companies so that they can actually help bring those things to life over time as well.
I would say, I think bubbles have pros and cons, so I wouldn't say that bubbles are a bad thing overall. I think, and also I wouldn't say that disruptors don't necessarily disrupt, because monoclonal antibodies at one point were a disruptor and they were a bubble. And I think many disruptors just need a few bubbles to actually get to being truly disruptive, because ultimately something starts usually in academia. You get some excitement, you get something which looks like it has huge potential. Companies get created around that. There's a setback. You actually find it's not as easy as you thought it was. And you have to make sure that there's enough investment and enough breadth of innovation and people doing different things with that technology to sustain it through the hard times. So if you think about monoclonal antibodies, the initial sort of excitement and wave was massively knocked back. People thought that actually this wasn't going to disrupt. Then there was a period where some people sort of really got into it and tried to work out how to humanize, how to make sure we weren't having an immune response. And now everyone sort of assumes they've always been with us. But at one point, they were a bubble, and they've been through various bubbles, and now they're sustained, and they live with us as part of the treatment armamentarium. And I think gene therapy will get there. Gene therapy, it's, there's excitement, there's total, all investment goes away. Then there's re-excitement. Then there's a challenge. So I think we're going to get there. We're not there yet. I think if you look at, drug conjugates as well, I used to work in drug conjugates at Bicycle, and when I was there, it was a sort of really tough time. Kadcyla came out, and everyone was super excited about drug conjugates. Then it got a bit tough, and there were a few failures, and people decided that wasn't going to be a great success story. And then now we've got the HER2 data, and they're, sort of back in. When I was having the pre-call, we were talking about the fact that you may not want everything to come back. I don't know, drain pipes, flares, but most things you maybe do want to come back at some point. Just keep them in your wardrobe. Make sure you've got enough cash initially invested, and then you can pull them out again a few decades later.
I think drain pipes might be back, actually.
You think
jeans.
drain pipes are
I think
back?
they're called skinny jeans instead. Not for me, but yeah.
So does what's in flavour, does that sort of impact on how you're choosing targets and how you're developing your business plan?
So for us, we're much more focused on the true biological rationale. So sometimes that, as I say, that does align with something which we know is incredibly hot, and it's great if investors are familiar with our targets, but ultimately we go back to the fact that we have a platform that enables us to go after targets that other people are struggling with. And so we look at the biology and make sure that what we're working on is what we think are the best targets ultimately for patients. Sometimes that aligns with where there's a lot of investor excitement, and other times it's just back to some fundamentals, and maybe actually investors have left that space because people couldn't crack that target, and therefore we think that we can and we'll be able to blow another bubble.
So we've got a couple of questions here from the audience. Thank you very much. So what should a small company do when their science or sector isn't hot anymore? Any advice on
Raise
that,
money.
Lars?
I would say raise money early, right? Be prepared, have enough runway. I think that starts actually earlier on, right? When you think about building your company, deciding early on how do you want to build your cap table, right? What are the sources of capital where you have conviction that as long as the science works out, right? We're doing research and the science might not pan out, but as long as you're delivering, that you are able to be able to raise the rounds of funding required to do the late stage work you're going after. And I think that is something, going back to the earlier question that you had, what the good, the bad, the ugly of a bubble. I think it creates excitement, it gets money into a given field. That leads to overcrowding oftentimes of a field. So we've seen that in some of my close colleagues built GW Pharma, which is another success story where you saw zero interest for a very long time in cannabinoid-based medicines. Then suddenly there was interest, and GW became very successful in developing drugs for MS and childhood epilepsy. And then with a boom in US cannabis companies, they really made it and eventually were sold for over $7 billion to Jazz, and now developing have a blockbuster drug for Dravet syndrome. Now, when you talk to the analysts on the banking side, what you realize that they oftentimes feel that they lose overview of a given sector. And so now moving on to the area that I've been active in the last 6 years, we've seen a similar explosion. Talking to the analysts that cover our stocks, that is what we learn is that they say, look, I'm looking now at 50 companies in the space, and it's very crowded. And I think that can also then eventually be a problem on the investor side, that they don't know what's real, what is the most exciting science, what's moving fast enough. And
yeah, completely agree. And I think cash is king is the number one thing for small companies, or any company actually, until you become that cash generative engine, and be creative. Because I think you're going to have to look for partnerships, strategic alliances, other options to be able to lengthen your cash runway, prioritize, because actually we can all do so much, but actually how much time is there in the day, and making sure you're focused on the right things. And in terms of differentiating is kind of the key point there you were kind of talking to at the end, which is making sure that whatever story you're telling in the market or privately, essentially that you have your points of differentiation versus your peers. Because you may be the only one doing what you're doing, or you may be one of 50. In the AI space today, in drug discovery, I think we're over 200, and there's like 79 that are really of scale. A lot of companies out there doing this, but it's how are you differentiated versus those other companies that make sure that investors or pharma partners will go, that's actually something I want to be part of. So yeah, it's for the smaller companies, there's a lot of things, but those are
Got any thoughts on
Yeah, I would add from an investor point of view that the most difficult part now from our perspective is enough hours in the day to see companies There's so many private companies and so many public companies. Just even at the conference this week, there's 20 or 30 companies more I would like to see than I can. And so that's a real difficulty. And I think, to Nick's point, being able to differentiate yourself somehow to be able to get in front of people is one thing. And I would say that there are a lot of very supportive, long-only European investors in life sciences. And alongside that, don't forget Europe is basically what I'm saying. But alongside that, making sure you're in the US as often as you can be, speaking to US investors, because that's probably where you'll end up listing. And they like lots of meetings before they invest.
Yeah. I think the other thing I would say, and this probably doesn't happen enough, and I think the challenge is ego, typically, is that if you really have come to a point where your particular technology is not hot and you didn't raise enough money in advance, then the consolidation is like the dirty word that nobody ever wants to do. But ultimately, if we think again about the long term, these bubbles drive a lot of innovation, and that breadth of innovation is fantastic, but actually combining some of that innovation might, in the end, move those fields forward more. And so often the barrier to consolidation is personality and it's ego. And I think we shouldn't necessarily, not push for consolidation to happen at the right time, in the right way, when there are challenges to companies raising money.
Eventually, if you succeed, it will work itself out. I mean, that's why the cash is so important over the long term.
So a couple more questions here. Another one for you, Lyndon. So cancer is heading for combo therapy. SMs are easier to add to therapy cocktails, are typically oral and cheaper. Clinicians prefer oral SME to biologic, sorry. IV biologic, sorry.
Sorry, say that. So my view on small molecule oral oncology is something that I've heard from literally every single large cap pharma exec since the IRA was passed. And it's not necessarily, there's an evolution that can happen between now and when the negotiations start. But, AstraZeneca was on their Q3 calls, said this explicitly. There's a big difference between 9 years until you negotiate a price and a 13-year. And so that now, this is a long-term, drug development's a 10-year time frame, and companies are now looking at where they're going to invest. And they are all calling out the difference between small molecules and, ADCs or antibodies. So, as I said, there's been a lot of talk from the execs about the fairness of that and how it evolves over time. But at the moment, if you're looking at share price performance of those smaller biotechs with targeted oncology versus elsewhere, they're underperforming. And it's been such a huge area of investment for so long. And, there's other more controversial things that are happening in terms of, what the FDA are looking for in terms of how you're developing these drugs. And, the IRA is starting to push the thought that you will, instead of going into the later lines of therapy first, you're probably going to have to hold it back and maybe invest for larger scale opportunities and frontline first. And this all plays into the hands of large cap pharma and unfortunately makes it more difficult for smaller biotech companies.
So a question here generally for the panel. Do you think big pharma creates bubbles with multiple copycat deals in the same hot area? And is this a good thing? Lars, do you want to take that one?
It's a very timely question. I wouldn't say it's only big pharma, right? I would also say on the investor side, one of the leading US venture funds actually started a perfect copycat of their own portfolio company last week, the only differentiation being route of administration of the drug, which obviously raised a lot of questions. Why would you do that? I think first of all, for the management team that is running the original company. Can you trust that investor going forward? One of the absolute blue chip investors, by the way. And I think it also creates a problem down the road. Probably then going to your point, eventually this needs consolidation if you have two drugs, the same API effectively that you're developing. And I think it leads again to the point of confusion in the markets, right? I think, Lyndon was saying, you're seeing so many companies. If you're an investor in that space, right, why would you unnecessarily add more complexity to that?
I think pharma validation, pharma being in a therapeutic area or in a mechanism is actually pretty helpful for small companies, because you're generally less bureaucratic, you can move faster, you can be more nimble, you can be more agile, yet you've still got the validation of a large cap company from an investor point of view. You're potentially a takeout target. There's a lot of positives, I think, around the pharma companies getting involved in some of these areas.
I completely agree, because, Lyndon said it before as well, there's not enough time in the day for investors. I think the stat I told this morning is there's 750 tradable biotechs in the US alone and 250 private waiting to go public. There's not enough investors to kind of cover that kind of bandwidth. So actually, when the big pharma strategics have got it's their day job to kind of look at these areas, these niches, and invest in these companies, when they're doing that, that's allowing people to say, well, there's obviously some interest here, and they're going to deploy capital into it as well. So is bubble the right word again? Debate. But is it creating interest in that field, and then it's going to drive more investment into it? Without a doubt. And then it kind of comes to, is it the right field? Debate again. But I think it's a good thing that those strategic validation points, not just for investors, but for the company as well, to know that they're on the right track. It's very important.
So moving on to a different topic. So a question here, is the COVID bubble over? Who wants to take that?
Yes. It has been for a while. Look at Moderna's share price. I don't know whether there's anything else to add. There's obviously the amount of... It was very good, not just for the vaccine companies and therapeutics companies, but for the biotech sector overall. There was so much focus, a global spotlight on what this industry can do. And, the ability for, the UK scientists and then also the mRNA companies to be able to take things through to patients and, generally to the healthy people in terms of the vaccines within a year has, been really awesome for the sector. However, in my view, there is, Pfizer will make some nice money for the next few years, so will Moderna, but otherwise it's going to be very difficult. And, the regulators are showing that they're becoming a lot more picky about what they want to see for an approval.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's right. There might be some benefits to come out from it in terms of development in the future and whatnot, and clearly it's shown the industry in a very good light, but it's almost, unfortunately, that the whole world is pivoting towards other things now. And so that kind of focus time investment's kind of not there in the same way.
So do you think, though, you said, there's some companies, Pfizer, Moderna, who've, they've got a lot of cash, they're sitting on a big war chest now. Do you think that they will use that to create new bubbles? How do you think they're going to use that funding?
So interestingly, what we're seeing or hearing or talking to, and probably there's no bankers on the stage here, so probably, maybe that's questions for later as well, but what we're seeing and hearing is that they are deploying a lot of capital, but more and more it's in those later stage assets that have got clinical data so that they can roll in to benefit their EPS. Because their investors are telling them, ultimately they need to think about this era of cheap money is gone. So now they've got to be very targeted with their investment, and it has to deliver returns quickly. So a lot more investment is going for those efficiency plays or assets that can deliver bottom line benefits pretty quickly. You will still see collaborations happening in early stage companies, even like our own. And there was one the other day with Sanofi and another company like mentioned. But they are going to be different kind of deal structures going forward because they obviously want to benefit their own P&Ls and not have 100 million come through as just a one-time payment. they want to see them structured in a different way.
I mean, Pfizer's been very clear that they're investing in later stage M&A, and they've already done 4 or 5 deals so far, and on their recent calls laid out what their longer term guidance is for BD. So no question, that's very much what they're doing. Moderna less so.
So, I mean, we're just talking about COVID in particular, how that bubble's ended. But how generally do you think a bubble ends? What are the sort of, how can you sort of see that a bubble is coming to the end?
I haven't actually I've tried not to use that word on this panel. There's numerous reasons why therapeutic areas become less hot. And actually, I think the FDA is a reason that a lot of them have, because we understand the science and, get as excited about opportunities as the companies do when we invest in them. And, we can see the commercial opportunity. And then the FDA changes the goalposts at the last moment, like it did for antibiotics. What would that have been nearly 20 years ago? Decided all of a sudden about non-inferiority margins while they were in phase 3. Or in the case of gene therapy at the moment, they allowed a few companies to get approval, and then they've changed the parameters on assays and other things that you have to be able to show. Now they're about to change the goalposts, arguably on oncology, and instead of being able to get through an accelerated trial simply, you now have to ensure that you're going to be in phase 3 with a confirmatory trial at the time of approval, which has already scuppered a couple of companies in the last 2 weeks. And so, they put that article out in the New England Journal of Medicine a month or so back, clearly stating that the accelerated pathway is being looked at, and they're going to kind of clamp down on confirmatory trials happening after the fact. So I think actually that is a risk somewhat that is very difficult, certainly as an investor, to be able to kind of discount, because the commercial side is relatively easy. The science, after you're invested in it, you're invested in it certainly from my perspective when I invest in companies. So I think that the FDA outlook is important.
Anyone else, any thoughts on how bubbles end?
A couple of thoughts. I would say when we look at a market in general, I think mental health has been a hot topic, especially on the private side of things. Also on the public side of things, rightly so. We had a massive readout recently at Karuna for schizophrenia. I think what you're seeing is that there's some pullback. So I think the round sizes are just becoming a bit smaller. I think that's what we've seen on a couple of very promising, actually, early stage companies, and then as a result of that, you see that the pipelines become more focused. So I think whereas in a very hot phase, you see companies go very wide and also do a lot of exploratory discovery work, and now what we're seeing is that indeed it becomes more narrow. You see a lot of partnering out of programs that are non-core, and I think that is an indicator of consolidation. And eventually, if a bubble really bursts, if it had been a bubble, I think then we reach a point of consolidation and we see mergers, fire sales, etc., which has happened in some of the hotter biotech areas over the last month.
I agree with that. And I think I agree, try not to use the word bubble, because I'd like to think that this industry isn't a bubble that we're all working in, and actually it's just trying to see progression over time. But when things do go, we live in a cyclical world. So as we go to those tough cyclical times, absolutely, you're going to see some consolidation for it. And you'll see people prioritize, focus on what's going to get them their next clinical data point or milestone to be able to then kind of move on from there and grow. And it's just about making sure you cut your cloth accordingly and you're on the right path. But I wouldn't like to think of it as a bubble bursting.
I think also it depends what's driving it. For technology, because you also get technologies that get huge amounts of investment because people get extremely excited about them. And I think just the promise is sometimes not as great initially, or there's some sort of hiccup that needs to be solved before the technology can reach its full potential. So there it is, typically data. There's some kind of data point and people pile out of something, and then there's often a few companies that raised enough cash to get past that particular hurdle, and then drive the technology to the next second generation and continue moving the technology forward. So those are also reasons that bubbles burst, but those often come back.
So next question is not so much about a bubble, but quite a few people have put this one forward saying, are European biotech investors still much more conservative than US VCs, e.g. they need pharma validation?
Wow, okay. I don't want to overgeneralize. So I think there's a difference in that question between a public market investor and a VC, to start with. I don't really want to go down that, but I mean, VCs are obviously going to take, invest in earlier stage companies relative to public market investors. There are a lot more biotech specialists in the US than there are in Europe, no question. And I think that, that opens up this view that Europe is more conservative. I don't stand by that from my own personal perspective. I invest most of the funds in US companies, and I know that most of the people who I work alongside who are specialists are not more conservative than they are in the US. I think that that's just probably a view that, I don't know. There's also the fact that there's a lot more hedge funds in the US, and maybe people think that, they're less conservative. So I would say no, but I do recognize it's interesting when US companies raise money and do their initial IPO, they now don't come to Europe to speak to European clients because they can pretty much get them done in the US with US investors. And then they come through difficult times, and that's when we see them in Europe. And that's because, as I said before, we tend to be longer term. We tend to be, partners alongside the companies. And certainly from my fund, we take a 3 to 5 year investment horizon. We tend not to trade around the positions too much, so they're like high conviction positions.
Yeah, I think that point you made about just there's more investors, I suppose, in the US who are focused on the space is just the reality. So there's more pools of capital over there for people to kind of access. So and then we're talking about individuals ultimately, and it's the individual's risk profile about what they're willing to invest in at what level and what's the thresholds for going across. So because you've got more investors, you're going to have more that are going to be at those thresholds that maybe are different to what they are from that smaller universe in Europe. So yes, you will see it.
But you dealt with US and Europe in your previous role. Do you think that they're different?
I think there's more. This could be topical. I think there is a bit of a difference sometimes, actually. So,
I think there is a bit of a difference. Yeah. I mean, I'm more in the private space and spent most of my career over in the US and came back to Europe. But I will say that it's about getting the right investor. So I absolutely think that there is European investors who are not looking for validation, and I'm privileged to be in a company where our conversations are about having a very high bar for any partnering, not for trying to get a partner to validate what we all believe about the strength of the company. And I've been in boardrooms in the US where I've been with investors who want validation. And ultimately, I think that for any company in Europe, capital actually is the easiest thing to move across geographies. And so I don't think of myself now as having European or US investors. I have international investors with international outlooks. Yes, we'll probably list in the US, but the conversation in the boardroom that we have is not about validation. And we're all in the UK at the moment, but some of our money comes from the US.
Maybe two thoughts. I agree with everything that has been said, and I think it's a question of supply and demand. Overall, I think there's just so much fewer capital in Europe to deploy in bio, at least on the private side of things. And it's actually on the private side, I would say, I'm a limited partner in a US early stage venture fund that has made it a target to actually invest a third of the capital in Europe in early stage, because they feel like they can get much better deals here. And in terms of speed and valuation, they will always outperform their European counterparts. And that's interesting to hear from a US fund. On the public side, I would say that, having gone through 2 NASDAQ IPOs over the last 3 years, it's quite interesting because also the banks have a bias towards the US. They feel like they can get deals done faster. And so the average roadshow today doesn't take 2 weeks anymore. It takes 3 days, sometimes 2 days, depending on what the asset is. And so there's only so much time you have in the day to be in front of investors. And so they have a clear bias for the large US pockets of capital where they put you in front if they can get a deal done with their network. They're very much in favor of that.
We did an analysis just recently looking at our stage. So we were looking at sort of the next financing, so Series C step-ups, and trying to see how important's business development been, and not important, certainly historically. If anything, more companies with higher valuations at that stage didn't have partnerships, and if they did, they tended to be premium partnerships. But we also actually did the analysis on European versus US, and it was very nice to see that the median valuation was actually higher for the European companies than for the US companies in that particular analysis.
So maybe one last quick question. So do you think bubbles or hot topics are a good thing? And what do you see as being the next hot topic?
I mean, I think they're good. They encourage investment. They the competition is a good thing in terms of defining what your differentiating points, making sure you're the best in class. It's where you can get capital easily. So that was the question: was it good? And what's going to be the next hot topic? On the positive, like hot, I would say neurodegeneration, and I would class that from. And neurology generally. And I think, the FDA's stance on aducanumab, as I said, although controversial, opened up the opportunity for smaller cap companies to invest in this. Let's see what happens going forward. But, Karuna's data, there's a lot of interesting things going on, and there's a lot of, sell side are now having to do a lot of work on this. It's funny because, I speak to some of the sell side investors, and 4 or 5 years ago, it was the oncology sell-side investor, sell-side analyst you wanted to speak to. Now it's more the neurology part. So it's interesting change.
Ross? So overall, I think it is a good thing. I think that you have to be careful within that environment to make sure you are thinking about differentiation, because it's only a good thing if you're approaching that innovation from a different perspective. So ultimately, you don't want to get stuck in some point with undifferentiated assets. And in terms of the next bubble, I have to promote our technology. So native mass spectrometry, we are the only company doing it today. But when I'm asked the question by investors about what is the protection behind your technology, clearly we have patents, we have significant know-how, but if I'm doing my job well, then everybody should want to be using native mass spectrometry much more aggressively in their drug discovery, because it can deliver compounds against targets where other companies have very publicly failed, such as vitamin D that I talked about earlier.
And, hot topics are good. We'll leave that one there, maybe not the bubble part. And I'll do the exact same plug, actually, and say yes. The use of AI in pharma R&D, I think, is only going to increase, and it'll spread across the entire spectrum of everywhere it's used. And for ourselves, why is that the case? Because we will hopefully increase the time to market for drugs, speed it up, make it quicker, and then ultimately, hopefully, have a better probability of success. And that is one of the big problems in pharma R&D is still the failure rates. 10%, essentially 90% failure rates, costing on average $2 billion to get a drug to market. And actually, if we can improve that meaningfully, then I think we let a lot of capital actually flow in the right direction within the industry as well, and towards more things to look at. So I think there is a silent evolution actually happening in the industry as far as AI application is happening as well.
Yeah, I would say probably a hot environment is good if you catch the wave early, I would say. If you are getting started when the tide is going out, that's probably not a good place to be at. And I think we've seen that quite a bit, where promising technologies in a space, maybe the second generation of a technology, were just about getting started when investor interest moved on. And no matter how good your technology then is, that might often mean that you find yourself in a consolidation play where you picked up from someone else. The good thing is, I think what's so exciting about our field that we're all in is that the assets typically survive, other than in other areas of technology, and are passed on. And so I think that's good. In terms of what are the hot areas, the next hot areas, I would agree, first of all, with Nick, where I think we're seeing AI being deployed across the biospace. So for example, we're deploying AI in order to discover nature-inspired compounds that have ethnobotanical history, where it's very obvious to use AI and not human capabilities to identify the most promising assets. The other thing I would say is what we're seeing is huge interest in indeed CNS. So we have 4 CNS companies under our umbrella, and they're going after different spaces, but neurodegeneration clearly is a very hot one, where I feel like with the current criticism of the beta amyloid hypothesis, we see a lot of interest as well in differentiated mechanisms to go after Alzheimer's, which I think is very exciting.
Well, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much, the panel, and thank you all for your contributions, for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, how's everyone doing? All good? I'm Tracy Chung. For those who haven't met me, I'm a partner at Consilium. I'm looking forward to meeting more of you in the breaks later on today. I joined Consilium about 6 months ago, and just after I started, a friend of mine said to me, "So how's the new gig going?" And my response was, it's a bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. There are so many exciting technologies, innovations, companies that we are surrounded by and lucky enough to work with. And I think we saw some of that in the panel today, so thank you very much to everyone in the panel that's just come before. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce panel number 2, which I'm sure will continue in the same vein. We are now moving on to explore how we can reimagine healthcare and create a new ecosystem for this new century, the middle of the 21st century. So we've got a budding team of experts here, brimming with ideas, knowledge, experience, and moderated by Jessica Hodgson from Consilium. So we have Hugo Fry, who's CEO of RQ Biotechnology, Melanie Lee, who's CEO of LifeArc, and Lachlan McKinnon, who is co-founder and CEO of Replay. Enjoy.
Thanks, Tracy. So we talked on the last panel a little bit about the kind of COVID dividend to society and healthcare, and how a lot of discussion was held and a lot of promises were made about how we could learn from the experience to optimize healthcare in various ways. I guess my first question for this panel is how successfully we've embedded that as an ecosystem in what we do, from the whole spectrum, from early stage drug discovery through to patient care. And I might pick on Lachlan first, I think, for this.
Sure, yeah, I think, one huge thing that's changed is the kind of venture capital interest in the vaccine space. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that pre-COVID, doing VC investment in vaccines was seen as challenging. And, it's taken this kind of black swan event for people to realize the economic case for investing in vaccines. And now, people forget that pre-COVID, Moderna and BioNTech were oncology companies. And so I think going forwards, we could see where that this may happen again. I think clearly antibiotics is an area where there's an existing kind of market failure potentially preventing investment in that space. And, are we going to need a kind of black swan event to get people to figure out some of the economic challenges around, preventing a pandemic caused by a bacterium?
Hugo, you've obviously got some background in vaccines as well, so it might be a useful segue to ask you your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll take Lachlan's vaccines and raise him to viral diseases and probably any disease that can be communicated. which would include antibiotics in that area. It's clearly an area. It takes a lot of investment in there. My background is I did many, many years at Merck and Sanofi with huge vaccines divisions. It's not an IP platform that you develop vaccines on. It's know-how and massive amounts of investment. So it does need that investment, but it is coming. And you can see it as well, that suddenly, like Pfizer said, well, okay, we're going to build a division. We're going to have a vaccines division and an antiviral division. I don't know why they've got a hole in the middle for monoclonal antibodies, but we'll see. Merck are building the same thing. And I think we'll see this expanding out, and we'll see it emerging as a more important therapeutic area with serious money involved. And with the big pharma money there, then the early VC money will come in, and then there'll be a meeting in the middle, and that will be a new kind of therapeutic area that becomes absolutely a substantial part of the whole ecosystem.
Melanie, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, the thoughts from me are slightly different in that obviously the awareness of the public of health, the importance of vaccination, and the status of yourself, your own health, it's a complete legacy of this time. And I believe very strongly that LifeArc, which is involved in translation, needs to take this to heart and never forget how involved the public want to be in their own health. They can use tests at home, they can understand their immune status, they can far, far better understand the importance of vaccines for one, but not just vaccines, now emerging antibodies that will give cover for immunocompromised patients. So I think there's a massive legacy, and I think we've really got to keep that up in terms of engaging the public and the patient with our work going forward.
What does that mean, do you think, for healthcare systems, given that that's often the kind of primary way people interact with healthcare? And does it matter if healthcare systems increasingly are disintermediated as a result of this more autonomous patient that you talk about?
Well, if I can start
Sure.
that, the answer to that I saw a little bit of insight with last week was when I saw the CEO of UCB speak about actually commercial placement of products now is so very, very important that you have patient buy-in for that. And he said actually you will get it completely wrong if they're not an integral part of the way you design the product that's going to get into the marketplace. So in a way, health systems are sort of disintermediated, but at the same time, I think they'll adapt if a patient's pushing hard enough to want to go to B, not A, and through a very arduous and slow process. So I have great hope for us being able to influence that whole ecosystem.
Okay. And Lachlan or Hugo, how does that influence the kinds of innovation that we see coming through this sector? Well, this business of patients being perhaps more empowered than they have been in the past.
Well, there was a trend that happened, and in terms of bypassing systems before COVID. In fact, it happened when Novartis bought Medicines Company and did this population health deal with the NHS actually in this country. And I think population health is going to be a buzzword that comes around, but it actually means something. Is to your point about bypassing systems, whereby we saw that on a massive scale with COVID, where whole governments and healthcare systems bought into innovation. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. They spread bet, and the good ones came in, and the whole of society benefited from it. And I think we'll see that in other therapeutic areas. I really do, and I think that is really key. And so that, I think the way you said it, and I hadn't thought about it that before, bypassing systems, that's the way forward. That's the way innovation will come through faster and to a greater population.
Lachlan,
yeah, I think a big kind of innovation that's now coming is liquid biopsy, and it's really just around the corner. And what's it going to require? A significantly kind of larger population scale kind of engagement with the health system at younger ages. And if these are going to be quarterly blood tests for pan population for people in their 40s and above, is our experience with COVID going to mean that gets adopted to a greater extent? I think possibly. So I think that could be one big change.
So liquid biopsy is an obvious one. Let's talk about other kinds of innovations that we think are going to define the next decade in healthcare. I mean, we can talk about anything from therapeutic advances to regulatory changes to policy changes. I'm just interested to hear what things you think will stand out at the end of the next decade as having really shaped the ecosystem. Whoever wants to take that first, maybe Melanie.
So my passion for the next decade is that the different industries start to break down their walls, which are commercially driven business models, which actually make it very uncomfortable, as I've been as an R&D director across pharma, biotech and medtech. We're confined in many respects by what we do by the business model and the need to get products out the door, which is understandable. But my passion now is that actually by arming patients with a better awareness of where you're going and awareness of what can be offered by the collective, I think we'll see suites of products coming forward, and I think you'll see a much better integration of predictability, diagnosis, devices and informative measures to actually help a patient understand where they are, and then therapies. So I don't think it's all about one therapeutic end product anymore, because patients can help themselves if they're informed.
Lachlan?
Yeah, I think, I see it from the kind of genomic medicines standpoint. I think, we're just at the beginning of the era of genomic medicine. And there's a few huge inventions that will massively impact medicine over the next decade. I think one of them is going to be when we figure out how to use IPS, induced pluripotent stem cells, as the cell source in cell therapy. I think that above anything will radically change the cost of goods for cell therapy, and will mean we can take cells into autoimmune effectively, but also bacterial and viral, if the costs come down to similar to small molecules. And I think iPS cells can take us there. There's a huge, there's a big technology problem in making them immune silent, and there's a number of companies working on that. And then again, I think in delivery for genomic medicines, it's still completely wide open. There's issues with AAV. There's LNPs that are really quite limited in terms of tropism. I think even with the history of gene therapy being where it is, it's kind of amazing that the delivery landscape is still completely wide open. I think the companies that crack safe, multi-tissue, high payload delivery can really make a big impact in that space.
Hugo?
Yeah, so I think I thought in the last panel, the remark about monoclonal antibodies and how they developed and how, maybe they weren't going to be the great thing and they became the great thing was a really good example. And look at them now. And so we've just seen the proof point again was COVID, but we've seen one with nirsevimab that's just been approved for RSV for babies. And we're going to see suddenly monoclonal antibodies going from something that was complicated, difficult, targeted therapy, moving to a mass part of immunization. So the label for nirsevimab was all newborns, whole birth cohorts. That's 3.5 million babies a year in the US, 700,000 to translate it into UK numbers. And that happened over a relatively short time of innovation in terms of development, manufacturing, cost of goods, which is really important. And so I think that space, the possibilities for monoclonal antibodies is really opening up hugely.
So we talked on this panel and on the last one about the time to development and the potential for that time to be accelerated. And obviously AI plays a critical part in that. How optimistic are you that that's actually going to change long term? And coming back to AI, a related question, do we think it's actually going to deliver on the promises and dare I say, the hype? And I'll direct that initially at Hugo, because it looks like he's dying to answer it.
Yes, there's a lot of hype around it, and it's an absolute buzzword. If you asked everyone in this room what's AI to you, I'm sure we'd get as many answers as there are people. But I think, again, nailed it on the last panel when they said, well, what's the goal of AI? Well, it's to decrease the spread of risk, isn't it? And make it more efficient to go forward. So the company that I'm running, we use computational IA, both at the beginning of our process to choose our reagents and our antigens to shove into mice. And we use at the end to then track viruses to see how they're going to develop so we can target the epitopes better. And there's some very good AI in those areas which will massively decrease efficiency. For example, and I think it's more easy to explain AI in concrete terms, you'd have to produce thousands and thousands of potential monoclonal antibodies and then sift through them to get down to them. AI will take it down into tens from thousands and thousands. And so you can just have to think, it's an easy way of thinking about the efficiencies that can bring and the decrease in the risk you're taking. So I genuinely think that layering that on top of whatever you're doing will produce efficiency and decrease the risk.
Melanie.
So where I look at AI, I think it's, and just the whole sort of data world, the sort of use of data alongside R&D, it's so very important, but it is still very, very disjointed. So the big challenge is to get a set of a time and a place in a company or organization or academia even where you make an incremental improvement, and certainly the antibody area is one where you see that now really making a difference to stop this having to sift through hundreds of thousands of molecules. You can get to one or two that are really looking hot. The problem is it's not joined up. So the danger is you spend a lot of money thinking you're going to actually go into an entirely integrated system. And I don't think people should aspire to that at the moment. I think they should really look at those steps where the if-only steps. It used to be like high throughput screening. If only we could actually screen 100,000 compounds a day, not 10, it would be so much better. So that's where we are, and you see some really brilliant technologies coming through there. So we mustn't be afraid of it, but we must apply it and focus it. And I think any little company that sets up should know what its rate limiting step is and where it can help, and really major on that, and then use, because otherwise you can't improve that scientist's process. Mm-hmm. It's the scientists that sort of stick to a process. In the bigger companies are even worse than the little ones, and sometimes you need them to embrace that incremental step.
Doctor?
Yeah, I think there's two areas where it works really well today. The first is, taking a lot of medical imagery, either from ultrasound or MRI or PET, and performing a diagnosis, better than the doctor can. And then secondly, obviously, we've had AlphaFold come out, and also Meta has now published something comparable. And so solving, getting a kind of rough start for a protein structure is now trivial, and I think that will massively impact basic science. I'm not totally convinced that will impact small molecule discovery as quickly, because it's not really the bottleneck, and you're still going to go and replicate that structure with traditional methods. So yeah, that's kind of two areas where I think it's very powerful.
Okay, thanks. Question that arises from all this is this huge flowering of innovation which we've seen come through across the industry. Are we going to be able to afford all of it? And critically, are healthcare systems going to be able to afford all of it in 10 years' time? Looking at some of the stress that the industry has or that the infrastructure really has undergone. And I'll direct that first at Hugo.
Yeah, so the simple answer, you can't never afford everything, can you? No. So the great thing is, and hence, and it was mentioned again, the IRA, which they're putting, which will only at the moment anyway impact Medicare for 3 years. If you've got a small molecule oncology product targeting younger patients, you're fine, I guess. Devil is in the detail. But on the other side of that, what is that paying for? Well, I tell you what, we wouldn't have any of the innovation that happened in the COVID periods without BARDA money. We wouldn't have anything. In fact, there was only one company that didn't take BARDA money, and that was Pfizer. But then they realized the name of the game, and they really did put the money where it was. But every single company, in case you didn't know, got $2 billion from BARDA. Every single one got 2, which allowed this risk-free run at everything. So that was what allowed. It was money that allowed people to take risk-free runs at everything. So it's not, that was big sums of money, but if you put the money in the right place behind the right programs and allow people to take those risk-free runs, and you scale that down to small biotechs like mine, and you have enough money and you have enough runway to do it, you can do amazing things. But if you're scrabbling, like I've seen in other biotechs I've worked with, where every day is just another set of VC pitches or investor pitches, or you're not doing great science and you don't have that really. So you need to direct that money at absolutely the right projects. Is it here in this area? Is it in another area? And then let it run, and it'll work.
Yeah, well, we can't afford the health system as it's emerging and behaving at the moment, so something has to be done. And one of the real purpose of innovation is to improve that inefficiency and all the inefficiencies that we're carrying today. And I think that's the real opportunity that we have. And from LifeArc's perspective, we're focusing on one area where we think it's massively inefficient, which is the translation from academic ideas into products, which are the fledgling products armed with the information they need to really start to be attractive to the commercial markets. So every organization can only do so much, but that's our sweet spot, and we're absolutely determined. We've got 1.3 billion pounds to put into these types of translation products, and we will do that, and we will make sure that we start to seed little companies with products across the spectrum of 4Ds, diagnostics, devices, drugs, whatever, and we'll hopefully open up a market and ultimately improve the efficiency of not just the R&D process, but the healthcare delivery processes that we're living in.
Yeah, I think, sorry, remind me of the question again. I got so into your answer.
The question essentially is, can we afford this innovation?
Yeah, I mean, look at gene therapy. It's coming in at $3 million per patient, and there's a number of reasons for that. It is, it's curative, so you have to get the money back over time, but the cost of goods of these therapies needs to come down. I think there'll be a ton of manufacturing innovation that comes concurrently with the product innovation, and there's no reason why complex genomic medicines can't be on a similar trend to antibodies, and over time we'll see, we'll see that change, and that will have an enormous impact.
So we've got questions coming in from the audience, which is great, and I will direct these at the people that they're aimed at. So Melanie, question for you: what part should the charity or non-profit sector play in healthcare innovation?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for that one. Well, as I said, I heard, is it Pascal? No, it's the CEO of UCB, Jean-Christophe Tellier. I talk about how the public are so very important to the future of healthcare, and how I don't think we can go back from the sort of ivory towers of doctors and medics actually knowing best, because frankly I think even they would say they really don't now, and the whole point of this innovation is that they come forward and they use technology. So I actually think our job is to make sure that the technology comes to the fore, and in every way that we put it out there, and but that's where charities are needed, and that's where charities coalesce around patients who know what's needed, and so they've got to be right at the front of your thinking about what do we do about this disease, and the power of people who have a similar problem working together to solve problems is absolutely amazing. So let's not underestimate that. Let's not pay lip service to patients, but let's ask them, what exactly do we need to do to help you?
Can I give a concrete example of that as well? Because it's really good about what do the patients do. So Lachlan's been talking really eloquently about gene therapy being the next thing coming through. Do you know the first commercialized gene therapy, where the discovery started? A patient charity in France called Geneton. And it was started by a woman whose son died of Duchenne's, and she started this charity, created money, and all the discovery came through the power of the patient and setting it up and going through. So absolutely.
Hugo, question for you. What learnings are you taking from big pharma into small biotech? And how are you using that to reimagine healthcare?
There's a really facetious answer to that one, isn't there? Yeah. No, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that the big pharma is slow. It is stuck in certain ways of doing things, layers of process, layers of management, difficulty to get things forward. And the joy of being in a biotech is you can go very quickly. You know, this morning before coming here, we had a meeting, an all-hands meeting. We took about 3 decisions right there that allowed things to move forward. And, you know, that's never going to happen. And I think that's the place. But we know our limitations as well. So we've positioned ourselves as very much as a preclinical company. Because in the area we're in, actually, big pharma are outstanding at doing the clinical development of these type of molecules. And so actually, everyone has their place in the ecosystem. And so we know our place, but the big pharma are pretty poor at bringing discovery up through to the clinical and pre-INDA because they're just so slow and small modeling. So that's where we position ourselves. So the learning is go where big pharma aren't that great, in fact, but do understand where they can add value, and they can.
And do you see big pharma as changing? Because obviously this has been a refrain for many years about big pharma, that it's slow and bureaucratic and lumbering and so forth, and you know, lots of efforts have been made by pharma companies to try and get past that. But do you think that it is evolving?
Yeah. So the short answer is no. I've been through circled through so many of these changes and new CEOs and honestly, it doesn't change. But where they have changed, where I saw, no, honestly, it's and it's bigger than them. They absolutely, I believed them. I looked in their eyes. I mean, Chris Feebacker, I worked for him for a long time, who's just been taken on a Biogen again. He wanted to do it. He absolutely did everything in his power. But the machine was greater than him, even at CEO level. But where they have got better, because it's competitive and they absolutely need to, is on their deal making. They used to be so slow at deal making. Now they know that someone else will come in. And so they actually have got much better at deal making.
Melanie, I think
yes, I'd just like to say so. I saw Stefan Ulrich last week at the FT conference. He's the CEO of Bayer, and I thought he was fantastic. He said that the whole of translation used to be the sort of where pharma specialised, and now they just don't, and they just can't. So actually, now more than ever, his quote was, academics need partners and partnerships in order to prepare themselves for working with pharma, and I think that's really true. So I think the will, I think the consciousness and the openness of pharma is what's really changed, and I think the partnership and therefore their ability to be sensible and good partners is actually very key and is a real blessing at the moment.
Lachlan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Okay. Another question for all of you. Do you think the government, and I don't know if that means government singular or governments plural, should help our industry more than they have done? And obviously the government was perhaps more involved in this industry in the past 2 years than it ever has been. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Well, it's very good when they get behind initiatives like neurodegeneration and dementia. It really helps because then they'll seed, like with the MRC, with DRI, and you know the other little charities that help and underpin DRI. They'll get behind it. They provide momentum. They provide Innovate awards and things. So that really does help. So you know, I think.
Yeah, I think going back to the antibiotics example, there must be a role for the state there, where, you know, we know that they're some of the most valuable things we have, but the economic case doesn't currently make sense. But we know it suddenly will, and you know, that will slowly evolve over time. And it's proven it worked in COVID. You know, unprecedented state support, you know, changed the landscape for vaccine development. And maybe around these kind of big themes, there's a place for government to organise.
And I'd add to, I agree with all of that, and then I'd just add to it is policy. So government policy needs to be able to free up capital to invest in the right things. So not just not government money, but there are policies across the board to allow it. And there are much freer policies in the US compared to Europe and even the UK. So what I'd say is let capital flow into these areas of great return and innovation, and let's get those policies in place.
What's the best way to inform? We've talked about this a little bit on this panel. What's the best way to inform and empower patients, and how should companies be involving them? Melanie, I think would be a good
Well, we're a charity, so I think things may seem slightly different, but the principles, considering we work amongst very much in the ecosystem, we actually involve patients right up front. So we look for specialist charities, because they're often very close to the patient, often run by patients. And then when we start translational challenges, that's one of our vehicles for getting research and big multidisciplinary programs out there around a central patient problem. So one, for example, is motor neurone disease. So we start with MND Association, and my name's Dodie, and we actually talk to them, and we talk to them and their clinicians, we talk to the patients, and we say, what is it we can do? What is the main problem? Well, of course, identify immediately when I'm diagnosed, I've got 12 to 18 months to live. This is far too steep a progression, far too late a diagnosis. So you know early diagnosis is really important to crack. But then en route through that journey, perhaps there's a lot more we can do. And you see even other industries like the car industry. I Will Always Be Me is a voice recording website. It's not started by the life sciences industry, but started by, is it Dell and car industry, to actually record voices for these patients as it fails them. So there is so much that can be done, and so much more innovation that is not actually as long-winded as getting drugs, which is the ultimate goal. So I think, I encourage us all to really be creative and hear what they need.
Lachlan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I go back to the liquid biopsy example. I think it's just going to be huge if we can empower people to, regularly test themselves, and there's an accurate, very cheap, cost-effective way of doing it. Then I don't see how that's not going to have an enormous impact on how oncology, the whole oncology landscape going forwards.
Hugo?
And I agree with all that, so I won't say anything else on that, but I'd just combine it with the public health argument as well. So understanding individual patients, but how they fit into public health. Something goes on. We're about to go into winter. So the only time I ever used to get an appointment with Simon Stevens was coming into winter, because I had a bunch of flu vaccines and he wanted to avoid the winter pressures that happened every single year. And it actually took COVID for them to expand the flu program, therefore to try and keep more people out of hospital to do it. And understanding what it is to be in hospital with flu, with COVID, what is measles, and because it has huge implications for everyone, because if you're blocking up hospitals, then you can't go and get your cancer diagnosed, you can't have your elective surgery, and so the ripple effect is absolutely gigantic. So individual stories, but rolled back up and back down through public health.
And a question that's connected to that, I guess, is how you see the role of the clinician changing in the 21st century. And Melanie, you've talked about this a lot, so you might be a good person to take this.
The clinicians actually, it's interesting, the ones that I personally have spoken to, many of them loved the COVID period in that suddenly they became mainstream research and involved in clinical studies that were really live and making a difference to today's practice. And they loved that. And several of them have said, it's just all gone again. It's just all gone. We're back to just the day job. And so there is really an opportunity to take these clinicians and involve them. That's why we involve them up front. But I think it's a very, very deep opportunity that runs through our NHS to actually engage clinicians and sort of make it. So actually, I think we should put effort into educating them, showing them what's coming, showing them what's coming and really making sure that they become part of the problem solving of how we're going to get things into the patient's hands.
Yeah, I think the potential collaboration between AI and the clinician could massively enable what you're saying, because it could free up all this time, and they become more of an interpreter and advisor, and can operate at a higher kind of human level rather than, doing repetitive tasks. And so if they embrace rather than fearing, replacement, if there's an embrace, then I think it could transform the role.
Hugo, anything to add to that?
Yes, so just to build on that freeing up of time. So actually one thing we do extremely well in this country, and we did it pretty well for COVID as well, is roll out vaccination programs. So the schools programs, if you've got boys and girls of around 12, they'll have their HPV in school, and that's why Britain has the highest vaccination rate in the world of that particular vaccine. And there are other examples of that delivery. And that delivery bypasses important healthcare workers that can then be getting on with other stuff in the healthcare system. So I'd love to see that expanded actually to other areas that then will mean other parts of the healthcare system and other patients can get better care.
A question that's connected to that, how can, and this is asked about the NHS, but it could be applied, I think, to most healthcare systems. How can we use patient data from the NHS better than we historically have done? Or do you believe the data will never be fully accessible? I think I might ask Hugo to take that one first.
So I've been involved in this discussion for quite a long time. I was vice president of the ABPI for quite a number of years. And we were always talking about it. And the potential is definitely there. There's this like giant database. If you think how much data we get, we go to Kaiser Permanente in the US, in California, at this amazing database. We pay a fortune with it and mine it for this incredible data, and we do fabulous studies. The NHS is about 60 times bigger than that. So the potential is huge. Now, it'll be interesting, the example I gave earlier, and I haven't been tracking it myself, but it'd be interesting to track the example of this medicines company, Novartis one, because the idea is that they build on that, and they will look into that database and see if that will come forward. That would be one example to go through. But there is a lot of administrative hurdle, which means it's not quite there yet for the NHS data, and that's why we're still going a lot to the US databases on the whole.
I actually had the opposite experience working OSC. We had several companies built on proprietary data sets, and it was an immense envy of the US that there existed these pockets, and it never felt like it was particularly well organized, but there were these incredible individuals who'd pioneered a kind of collection of a data set over a long period of time, and that was accessible, and we felt like we were world leaders relative to what the US had, and that's what drove a lot of the investment.
Melanie?
Yeah, I think there's a forward movement of consenting patients now for long-term studies, and I think we'll find there'll be a lot more engagement in that type of activity than ever before. Obviously, we're impatient for the retrospective analysis of clinical data, but that isn't easy because you have to have expert curators of sort of very imperfect data capture. So I'm sort of much more positive about the forward picture for longitudinal studies, just by general population becoming integral to how we live our lives and being much more open to that sort of information going out there.
And just to prove that I was unbiased and looking at the bigger picture, though to both Hakan and Melanie's points, our company was built on NHS data. So, in fact, data coming out of blood samples from NHS patients and NHS staff, which are a very good source because they all consent very well, the NHS staff. So actually we can take them and we can extract it. And so from convalescent human blood, which had consent, we extracted our monoclonal antibodies and then developed and characterized them going forward.
A question that was directed at Melanie, but I'm sure you'll all have a position on it. Is the UK overcoming its traditional problem of translating great science into commercial viability, and what do we need to do better? So Melanie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, we're fortunate to have a life arc in our midst because we didn't before, and it's an additional source. But what we're finding is that being able to invest, because we have an early ventures sort of de-risking investment group with a lot of science diligence around it, that is in itself attracts others to us because they like the diligence. They oh well, if you're convinced, then we'll look even harder. I think it's over 400 companies we've looked at this year. We've invested in 3 or 4, so the competition's massive for money, but we're also seeing US money coming in. I think we heard that on the previous panel. It was a somewhat cynical comment because they can get good science cheap, but actually it's good science. So, and maybe in the long term it won't be so cheap, because certainly we found with proven modalities like antibodies and biologics, those little companies are like little hot potatoes at the moment, and they go out to pharma straight away.
I think we need to kind of collectively actually kind of reject this narrative that the UK is somehow not that good at this, and it's completely changed in the last 10 years, and we're basically we're a big player now. And look at the guys from DJS who started in Oxford 10 years ago, just had a huge exit to AbbVie. It's the the envy of Boston, that deal. And I think that the narrative can kind of get reinforced if we keep having the conversation. And in a sense, we just need to lean into the new future where we're part of the incredibly competitive player in the space.
Hugo.
So I absolutely agree with that. So the question for me is, how do you lean into it? And so first of all, I would say I'm internally grateful that we have a life arc in our midst, because otherwise my company wouldn't exist. So that was absolutely fabulous to put that in. But how do we lean into that brilliant science that's going on? And there was a trend that we are coming out of, which was very different to the US companies, of which I've been involved in a couple, where it's not quite the right word, but it kind of explains it, that they professionalize themselves much quicker and with a lot. And, we were happy to have our brilliant kind of scientists just kind of bubbling around a bit, and that was a kind of good look for us. And we shouldn't be happy with that look. By leaning into it, we need to build up our structures quicker, professionalize them more, and then get them a better, more honed message out there more quickly. And I think that's the way we lean into it.
Do you think that's changing? And do you think that the kind of investment culture allows for that to change quickly enough? You're talking about this
I think that's it, because I think it is changing. The British companies are going forward like that, and they are gaining the investment to go forward, and they're getting success. So then it will follow.
I was just in California doing a raise, and everyone was telling me about their UK trip coming up, and it felt like I wasted my time on that. I should have stayed here and met them when they came here, and so I think it's the kind of the phase where I think it definitely was the case is over. I think we need to just kind of all agree it's over, and stop bringing the question up on panels, maybe.
Okay, I've been told. Okay, well, just to round things off nicely, we are getting to the end of this session. The question that's come in for all of you is, what's on your Christmas wish list? And that could be either you as a company or corporate entity, or you in terms of the sector. What do you most want to happen for Christmas? And I'll start with Lachlan, because he looks like he's thinking about it a lot.
Well, we are in the middle of our Series A financing, so that would be great. But
talk to Santa about
we're also we've just become a clinical stage company, so we're incredibly excited about getting into the clinic in March next year, and building towards that, and so just kind of progressing that program, really.
Melanie?
We're about to launch 2 of our translational challenges. So my wish list is they go well, they attract the right level of attention, and people understand why LifeWalk's on the map now.
Hugo?
So we develop monoclonal antibodies for viral diseases, which is going to touch vulnerable patients. And my Christmas wish is vulnerable patients in viral diseases don't get left behind like they have in the past. And as we saw in COVID, and so the future for them will be as protected as for the rest of us.
I think we've got time probably for one more question, and I'm going to ask everybody to take a step back a bit outside of the kind of corporate world, and say what single thing do you think will be most unrecognisable about this industry in 10 years' time? What would have changed most? Lachlan?
I think if the impact of incredibly low-cost, highly engineerable cell therapy on other areas will be incredibly surprising. And the company that can solve that big challenge of making an iPS cell immune silent, opens up this incredibly big space, and they'll be very competitive with all the other modalities.
Great, Melanie.
I hope that life sciences will become more diverse than it is now, and that all sectors of the public will be as engaged in their healthcare as we were during the pandemic.
Hugo.
I really hope that for life sciences, the policy changes are put in place in the UK that will also help us lean into it and make it blossom, whatever the therapeutic area, whatever it is. Because I think there is a lot of tied up capital in the country, because there's such a financial capital around here. There's so much tied up capital still that if we let it loose, the science is there to invest in, and I think we'd see some amazing innovation.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of you for joining the panel, and I think without further ado we shall head off so everyone can stretch their legs and grab a cup of coffee.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to Consilium's 10th Annual Healthcare Conference. Thanks again for joining us, and I think we've all had very good discussions of the first couple of panels. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce the third panel, but before I do, I would like to again just encourage everyone to use Slido to ask any questions in real time during the event. The details are there on the screen to your left. From left to right, it's my pleasure to introduce the august and austere panel that we have, hopefully for a lively debate. From left to right, we have Jorge Santos de Silva, co-founder and chief executive officer of Moonlake Immunotherapeutics. We have Georgi Egorov, who is a chief financial officer and board member. We have Tom Burt from Sofinova, Sander Slotweg from Forbion, Lisa Anson from Redex, and Nick Moore from Stifel. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for those words of welcome. And it makes my job very easy when you have a panel this talented. So I'm making that observation at the beginning, not the end, so they all feel under appropriate pressure. So the title of our panel is Managing a Downturn, Market and Financing Considerations in a Bear Market. We spent a few moments thinking about this panel a couple of weeks ago. I think it's very important not to be too gloomy. I think that there's an awful lot of good things going on. Look, clearly the market has been much more challenging in the last recent period. Tracy alluded in one of our opening remarks earlier to children in a sweet shop. I think life sciences executives, investors, bankers have maybe felt like children in a sweet shop over the last few years. I think the question, over the last 12 to 18 months is, did we just fall out of the back of a plane and have we got a parachute? So clearly a pretty different environment, but there are definitely some really strong positive messages here coming out of the changes. And Lisa, maybe I can come to you and Tom first, because we worked on a transaction earlier in this year which was very, very successful, where you raised a significant amount of extra capital. What were some of the changes in dynamic that you saw in that process versus previous fundraisers?
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick, and great to be here. I mean, it's been a tough year for everyone fundraising. I think for us as Redex, so we're a small molecule company, really innovative precision medicines. with assets in the clinic. And I think that helped us with fundraising because it's a very real, clear value proposition. So I think the underlying fundamentals are always going to be important. But overlaid on that this year, absolutely instrumental for us, and I'm not saying this just because Tom is sitting on our panel and he is one of our investors, but inside investor support was critical, but even more so than usual, partly because some of the new investors were prioritizing their own portfolios if they themselves were short of funds, so you had that kind of additional pressure to bringing in new investors. But certainly if you were going to bring new investors, which actually we did, or you wanted to raise at anything like your market price when you're publicly listed, as we are, having that internal support was really important. So we were rock solid with that, and that really helped us to get our round away at market price and indeed bringing in new investors. So we were delighted with that. I would say that being listed on AIM, if anybody is still deluded, that didn't help us specifically, although it goes down as an AIM-listed transaction. It was all the specialist investors who really helped us to fundraise.
Yeah, perfect. And maybe, Tom, you could just share some perspectives from, I guess, you're on the board, so you are actually on the same side of the table, but in terms of, an investor in that transaction, just, how did that go for you?
Well, I mean, Lisa's far too kind. I don't think our input had much benefit. I think, insider support is obviously important, but I think far more important to REDX is the quality of the science and the quality of the management. I mean, Lisa's not said it, but REDX has discovered one of the most valuable drugs to come out of the UK life sciences industry in pertobrutinib. I think third or fourth or fifth. One of the, obviously Humira is the most, but incredibly valuable science. And like anything, that science will, of quality, will be recognised. And certainly on that financing. The number of interested parties from both this side of the Atlantic and the US was notable. And that all goes down to that quality will get rewarded. And so very encouraging. And that also is reflected in the price. I mean, Lisa said, I think the deal was priced in February at 58, 59p. The previous round had been priced in December 20 at about the same price. So it was a sort of flat round on that basis, but over that same period, the indices had collapsed 60%. So that is meaningful in terms of what the market thought to the deal.
I think a lot of companies, public or private, would be delighted to do a flat round. Right?
Absolutely, it's the new up round.
Yeah. And Sander, maybe I can play you in here to give a little bit of perspective. Lisa touched on the importance of having really strong current shareholders. Are you finding in your investments in your portfolio companies, that they tend to be insider rounds, and it's harder to get new investors involved at the moment?
Well, if I look at our recent rounds, I think it is very important that the insiders significantly support such rounds, but we've seen all the rounds with external participation. But I think it's all about the negotiation position that you can project. If you have very strong insider support, then kind of the external validation, if you will, becomes more optional. Mm-hmm. And then we've seen that 5 out of the 6 recent rounds we closed were actually up rounds, even up to 100% compared to the previous price. But it all depends on strong insider support. So I think in choosing your investor syndicate, to look for investors with deep pockets that are not momentum investors but are fundamental long-term investors in today's market is very important.
And in those rounds that you did that were up rounds in terms of valuation, was it more challenging to get new investors in? Were they more led by insiders or not necessarily?
No, because then it wouldn't be a true up round. If it's just a pure insider round, you can put any valuation. No, these were actually the more hotly contested companies in our portfolio, where there was a lot of demand, where there were competing syndicates to join as external.
So it goes back to Tom's point around the quality of the science, the quality of the management team, the quality of the investment proposition.
Exactly. Yes.
And Georges, maybe I can play you in here, because you consummated a very interesting, very successful transaction, and maybe you can give us a bit of perspective on that.
Yeah, so Moonlake went public 9 months after, actually 11 months after we were founded. We went public in NASDAQ through a SPAC deal. That was a very interesting time in SPACs because at the beginning of 2020, late 19, it was all a fast way to get public. But as we went through the process, actually, that was the time where the SEC was upping the ante in terms of the quality of the submission, etc. And so for us, it actually played well because I think at the end of the day, people realized that ultimately SPAC companies or de-SPACed companies in that case are actually, basically have to follow the same rules and the same reporting that any IPO-based company has to do, right? So I think that elevated the bar. It was a bit painful for us because we were not ready for it. We thought we would get there faster. By the time we got there in March, the world looked very bleak. But we raised what we needed to raise, mostly actually through the pipe, not through the trust of the SPAC. And now I think people realize that we've had to set up the systems and the compliance to be working like any other public company. And I think that helps us out there in the market.
Yeah. And it sounds as if your redemptions were pretty much complete, and it was effectively an IPO of the company through the pipe. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, if you're in the world of SPACs, the less negative is actually a positive because everything was so negative. So we were actually one of the SPACs that still got an interesting percentage from the trust, but it was not sufficient for what we were trying to do. We're a clinical phase company. We're running 2 global phase 2s, 500 patients in total, so it's a big investment. So we needed to raise the pipe, and I think we still got some from the trust. We had a lot of people in the trust that actually did the pipe as well. So that's a form of insider and external mix as well. But I think at the end of the day, it was obviously the pipe that allowed us to do what we wanted to do. So at the end, it was a little bit of an IPO as well.
Yeah.
But still, with all the new rules from the SEC, it was still faster. And we're very happy with where we landed.
Well, congratulations. And maybe, Georgi, I can play you in here. What are some of the themes that you're seeing with the companies that you work with?
Sure. So my last role was the CFO of Vaxitech, and we went public in 2021. Also NASDAQ, always a direct listing. And it was a very interesting experience. So obviously, it was very intense, and I think we just managed to squeeze into this window when the markets were fully open. But I also believe that there was a bit of exuberance in the market, so because there were lots of passengers. Let's face it. So while actually the core biotech investors in here, they stayed, but there were lots of generalists who maybe shouldn't have been there because their understanding of biology was actually turned out to be very limited, and that's what we realized very, very quickly afterwards once ultimately market sentiment has changed and they didn't know actually how to differentiate between the companies. So what I see right now, and then definitely that's the over the time of my public market experience, I think the selectivity has increased. Actually, I don't think that the markets are closed, especially private markets, by the way. There are plenty of deals getting done, but they're very selective. They're very interesting companies, and then either with the innovative technology, which ultimately can have significant impact or be very disruptive, or we're going back to the playbook pre-2018, where ultimately clinical assets, and most likely with the proof of concept, they're getting valued, and not something which is before that. And another thing which maybe I'm jumping a bit too far, so what I'm seeing right now is no one really knows what's this biotech nuclear winter continue, for how long it's going to continue. So I think we in biotech, we've been following also the playbook from tech, from big tech. And as we can see right now, so people starting realizing, do we need to have X programs which will take that much over capital, whereas our investors are only looking at the 1, 2, maybe 3 programs, which are the value drivers. And that's what we see more and more right now. And I think there will be more people will be cutting programs, and I think, unfortunately, the industry might decrease from the headcount standpoint. Perfect. So there's some tough decisions will need to be made, most likely.
Yeah. So one of the other themes that I'd like to explore is this sort of idea of a risk-off versus a risk-on market. And I think if you look at the performance of companies either by market cap or by stage of lead program, there's no doubt that a later stage less risky, with less clinical risk, less regulatory risk company share prices have performed better in the last period, and preclinical companies that are public have definitely been hit the hardest. I mean, Tom and Sander, maybe as investors, how do you think about the relative merits of investing in public or private companies? Would a preclinical company be better off raising money privately and staying without the burden of that share price for a little bit longer in this market?
You go first.
Yes, I would definitely say so. I think if markets have too long of a bull run, as we've seen on NASDAQ essentially since 2013 when it opened, at some point, the later stage companies, you just run out of them. So the companies that got listed towards the end were exciting, pre-clinical companies, very far away from major value inflection points in the clinic. And I think that has caused actually some of the downturn that we have seen. There was just too much fluff in the market, and the end result is that now that there's less money chasing the companies in the existing universe of companies out there, that the focus will definitely be more on late-stage clinical companies. And so I think that's now the name of the game, certainly in public. So, for instance, also one of our companies, which is a late-stage clinical company, it was a private company, New Amsterdam Pharma, with several phase 3 programs going on. They also, through a SPAC merger, will be able to go public. And they've raised a significant amount of money also through the pipe, 235 million. And I think there was interest because of the fact that they do have these late-stage programs ongoing, which are already substantially de-risked from the earlier clinical data that have been published. So yes, I do think that is the case, and preclinical companies therefore are better off, finding private money.
Sure. I mean, I totally agree. I think the pendulum swung back towards the providers of capital. Thankfully, like ourselves, I think over the sort of 2020-21 period, certainly our colleagues we have colleagues that sort of look at earlier stage. I mean, they were seeing deals where term sheets submitted before the companies had actually been met with investors. Incredible sort of bubble mentality. So that has definitely ceased, and it is that back to normal functioning of deals chasing capital. I mean, I would step back and think, well, your question on stage is interesting. I suppose looking at some of the broader themes in the space, and this is one we tell our investors, is you look at the top line of some of the big pharmas, and post-2025, names like BMS, names like Pfizer, names like GSK go top line growth negative. And I know one of the earlier panelists was mentioning this, and that is a big thing. So they after 2025, they've really got to fix that. And so they're not going to fix that by focusing on platforms and companies that may solve that problem 10 years out. They've got to focus on the next 5 years. Where's that revenue going to come from? So that theme is certainly influencing the stage. And yeah, you're seeing it in the premiums paid for sort of late stage commercial assets overtaking the premiums paid. And that's straightforward analysis for platform companies.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But maybe, Lisa, I could play you in on that topic of sort of, strategic partnership licensing deals, because, obviously one of the very validating steps for you guys was a licensing deal, which then, catalyzed a big M&A deal.
Yeah. I think, one of my mantras always is, the job of a CEO is actually just generating options, right? We have to have optionality all the time, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. So if you're going to steer a course through growing a company with all these different scenarios, whether you go direct listing, whether you go SPAC, whether you're doing some reverse merger, some are in your control, some aren't. And the same, I think, is true with licensing. So for us, it was to show we are a company, as my team might say, we're a real company with real assets generating real value. So it's not sort of some smoke and mirrors. There's actual assets that have value, and we wanted to have those proof points. So I think it proves two things, actually: the quality of the assets, so that you can have valuation. We have a partnership with AstraZeneca and partnership with Jazz, both of which are going really well. We have 5 molecules that we've generated that made it into the clinic. 3 are out licensed and 2 are with us. So we have a kind of balanced split of value where we've taken some non-dilutive financing and we've got others where we're really taking the risk and going to the next inflection point. But I think it shows something more than just the value of the assets. I think it's really important in this market to have a management team that can make decisions and show that they're not trying to do everything to everyone and keep everything. So we have a lot of feedback from investors to say, actually, the quality of kind of portfolio decisions and conserving cash and making sure you get some things that really generate value has had good feedback. So I think it's a management team validation as well as an asset, actually. But it's very important, the optionality, whether it's licensing deals or any other type of deals. You have to have options in this market, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Now, keep the questions coming in. We've got a good anonymous one to start off with. Have bankers promoting fluff damaged the credibility of the sector? So, nothing if not thought-provoking. As the only banker on the panel, I'm going to answer that last. So, George, why don't you kick us off? Because you're furthest away from me.
Okay. I mean, as somebody that has been in and around the market for many years, I would agree. I think also there's a lot of scientists that are putting a lot of fluff out there. And as Georgi mentioned, I think there was a moment there where perhaps the level of sophistication on average was a little bit lower, right? So I would say that obviously we had something that, you call it a bubble, call it whatever we want to call it, and that was obviously driven a lot from the bank side. I think that also reflects our personal experience in the market, which is there's also an incredible spread and variance among banks, right? So there are banks that are really very knowledgeable, that take their time and understand what they're doing, and there are banks that obviously play the volume game, right? And I think that in general hurts the industry a little bit. So.
Georgi, you're nodding sagely in agreement.
No, because it's like a bit of a respite. So in my previous life, I was a banker for 17 years as well, maybe took 50 companies public. But I think it's very difficult to generalize. So of course, there's some culprits, let's say, who would come and say, oh, you're ready, don't worry, you don't have any clinical assets, but the market is there for you. Just ensure that you have the insiders, put in the book covered message, and then so it will be a done deal. So equally, there were plenty of other, especially in my previous company before Vicetech, Accenture, so there were plenty of bankers coming and saying, oh, you guys know, so that's something which is completely undoable, what you're doing here, machine learning, drug discovery, chemistry. So no, and then only just 2 years later, just knocking and saying, please, please, please get us on the mandate. But at the end of the day, I think investors on the public side, they need to be more diligent and not just being followed by the books covered message and saying, okay, so am I expecting some bleep in the share price and I'm going to flip the shares the next day? No, and I think ultimately, maybe all what's happening right now in the past 2 years, it's a bit of a cleanup.
Yeah.
So that for everyone, by the way, for bankers, for companies, because sometimes I look at it thinking, like, honestly, guys, like, you don't have any data coming out of the company for next year and a half. Why do you want to be public? Yeah. And also for investors, that ultimately be driven by fundamental values and not just the share price performance on day one.
Yeah. Maybe Tom, Sander, you guys, we can play you in here. Do you see sometimes bankers pitching you an IPO for a portfolio company when it's just too early? Have you seen deals being offered to you as investors that you just think, that this company is not yet ready for public markets?
Well, you can't blame the companies to want to raise money when the times are good. I mean, that is a very sensible strategy. I totally agree with Georgi's point about the sort of oversupply, and I mean, biotech unfortunately there's a lot of replicative financing. There's a lot of different approaches that need to be tested. I mean, I don't know how many cell therapy companies are out there now, probably 300, 400. Yep. And by the sort of, we saw this in paleobiology, the Cambrian explosion was followed by the the Devonian extinction. There will be some rationalization and some companies will go to the wall. But you wouldn't know which one necessarily is that until you've tried and tested. But I mean, so I don't blame the companies. I think, it's up to the investors to really maintain that, sense of what they are looking to invest in. And, throughout the pandemic, we've got to, really hold true to the belief that biotech did solve the issue with the pandemic, and that is something that obviously was not lost on generalist and tourist investors into the space, but they cannot be relied upon. And you know, as soon as the economies have opened up, we've seen that sort of tourist capital evaporate, which is benefit for us because we're long-term, strategic investors. We're here for the long haul. But fundamentally, as I said at the beginning, I mean, it's quality stories like sort of RedX where we'll come through and shine through, and to me, that's what as investors we should be focusing on.
Anything to add, Sam?
Well, nothing substantial to add. I like the term tourist capital because that's kind of what we have seen. There's just too much money that has been chasing too few quality deals, pushing up prices. So I also feel that what we have seen is more of a healthy correction. Of course, we're all for now caught at the short end of it, but markets seem to sort of bottom out, and I think from here we can start building again. Our funds do not invest in IPOs, but we do have an allocation within our growth fund to invest in more like fallen angel type situations. And I think that's also, of course, now an opportunity that there are many good quality companies out there that have maybe the wrong shareholder base or have had some adverse conditions to overcome. So I think there are a lot of high quality investment opportunities now for those that are looking and that have capital, and so I see it more of an opportunity. I wouldn't blame per se the bankers because you also cannot blame real estate brokers for wanting to sell houses or apartments, right? So it's your job to, and at the end of the year there are healthy bonuses to be won. So I think it's more an issue with the investors. Investors are ultimately responsible for what they buy.
Right.
And you just have to be in this space. You have to be super knowledgeable.
Good. So to sum up, it's the company's fault or the investor's fault, but not the banker's fault.
Fair
is that fair? Right. Let's move on. There's always a career in politics after this. So we've got some great questions coming in here. I'm going to go back to Georges first because I think maybe look. Does your SPAC transaction is that the exception that proves the rule? Have we seen the end of SPACs?
I think there's many exceptions that prove the rule, right? I think, like everything else, I think if the SPACs that you see performing better, and I'm thinking to the beginning of 2019, which is when the whole thing started, SPACs existed for a long time. Right? It's just that people didn't use that vehicle. Right. With the old regulation and the new regulation, I think I would venture to say that the ones that do better are the ones that have management team that is respected by the investors and the board and creates optionality, that has great assets, and that is doing a good job, right? So I think SPACs for now I think are a little bit complicated. There's too many that need to disappear. If I can be direct, there's still a lot of stuff out there with the tourist investors that's going to run out over the next 12 months, at least in the U.S. So once that cleans out, I could imagine that down the line, people will come back now that also the regulation, sponsor shares, pro forma reporting is also clear because we found that oftentimes investors couldn't even really understand what we were doing. So once all this cleans out, I think SPAC will be a mechanism like any other.
Yeah. Perfect.
By the way, I should add that obviously we had to do a SPAC. We were founded in May 2021. So when we wanted to get listed at the end of 21, beginning of 22, there was no other way. We could not do an IPO. We didn't have history, right? So I think that will still be an opportunity for companies like us that license something from pharma and need to move quickly. Right. So I could see them coming back.
Because under the Jobs Act, you still have to have at least 2 years of financials, right? And you didn't even have one. So
we had zero.
I do think going forward, I don't expect a lot of new SPACs to be raised simply because of the increased scrutiny from the SEC and also quite honestly the costs, because it's really doing an IPO twice. You do the IPO of the SPAC itself, and then you do this de-SPAC, the SPAC merger, and all the requirements and bankers around that really add to the cost. So it's not much of an advantage in terms of time to market.
I knew you were going to get
so we can blame the bankers for
bankers,
the SPACs.
Well, at least you're balanced, Sander. Right, so what will the IPO rules be when the market reopens? And maybe, Georgi, I can come to you first, because with your Vaxtech IPO, that was sort of, I guess that was the tried and tested formula of a crossover round going into a NASDAQ IPO. Do you see the crossover round here to stay when the market reopens? What are some of the characteristics of those first few successful IPOs, you think, when the market turns?
It's a great question. Overall, I believe there's a little bit of was over-reliance on crossover rounds to fix the valuation. And obviously to ensure that the investors who participate in crossover round do follow an IPO and become the anchor investors, if you want. So I think, personally, I think it should change because also it provides a little bit unrealistic entry point for the valuation, number one, right? Because it's not the market discovery, but I think many of us now have been through different pitches, but ultimately said, okay, your crossover round was X, so therefore, so you had this crossover round for 6 months, therefore your IPO valuation is between 20% plus to 70%. Where's the science over here? So from this standpoint, I think it's great to have crossover investors because it's the overall support, especially if, for example, if my colleagues over here do not have a mandate to invest in public markets, you obviously want to have someone who can support you during the private rounds, but also in the public life and continue buying. From the rules perspective, I'm sure we have lawyers in the room so they can comment, but overall, I do not expect significant changes because overall the process is relatively straightforward. It is a complicated process in the US, obviously, but if you are emergent issuer or if you are a foreign company, so ultimately there are plenty of rules which allow the relatively, if not easy, but more straightforward entrance into the public markets and have access to the capital. And then luckily we did not have in biotech, we did not have any big scandals recently with accounting. Touch wood, yeah.
Good. Sorry.
I was just going to you look at sort of how healthcare as a component of the total number of IPOs. You're looking at the past 5 years, 40-odd% of US IPOs have been healthcare, the large majority of which have been biotech. And so I think we should never forget that institutional investors, biotech is an asset class they need to focus on. Perhaps 20 years ago, that was not the case. They could allocate 5% of their portfolio to this wacky stuff that's called biotech. But now it is a proper, authentic asset class they need to pay attention to. That's more IPOs than tech. So it's impactful on that basis.
Great. Lisa, maybe I can ask this question to you initially. How should companies communicate with investors in a bear market? What should they consider, and should they change anything compared to the good times?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I still believe in communicating your fundamentals really well. So the quality of the assets, the quality of the science, absolutely front and center. I think the messages that I would always put in an investor discussion anyway, because I believe them, but I would probably dial up in a bear market are, the quality of the management decision making. So you get confidence that you're not going to keep on investing in stuff that should have been stopped, which is always a concern. And by the way, that's true in a big pharma company as well as in biotech. It's just not so publicly visible. So I think the management decision making and the kind of groundedness of where you're going to make decisions or let staff go, if that's the right thing to do. So are you doing the right thing to create value and committed to that? I would certainly dial that up with investors. And I would also be very realistic because the investors who I've talked to, and I'm sure everyone in the room's got lots of experience of that, but they get out, I don't know if you guys do this, but they get out their sheet and they say, right, what did you tell me last time? And then they look at, what are you telling me this time? Oh, you've actually delivered what you said you would. Great, I'll carry on talking to you. So your track record of delivery, I think, becomes even more important as you move into the clinic. It's like, are you actually delivering what you say you did last time?
It's basically an exam every time, right?
Yeah, so sometimes it can feel like that. Some of it, but it can also be fun, right? But I would definitely dial up the delivery and the management judgment as well as the science. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I think in these times you have to underpromise and overdeliver. Otherwise, if you don't deliver on all your promises, you at some point become kind of a show me stock that people do not believe you anymore, and they will only invest in you once you have finally arrived at your long-term value inflection point. So I think that's very important.
Anything to add?
Yeah, so I think I 100% agree with Lisa, and especially on the portfolio allocation point. I think it becomes extremely important right now because one way or the other, but investors do build their models. Yeah, so and ultimately with the cost of capital rising, so of course, so some of the programs might not actually make sense, or at least from their perspective, not from the company's perspective. So portfolio allocation. But on the tactical side, I think it's fair to say that anyone who's got any investor relations with the public markets recently, cash became larger king than before. So ultimately, whereas before the market sold off, so to say, the assumption was if you're a public market company, you can raise capital pretty much no matter what, because there's a public benchmark over there, and then with a discount, you can raise more equity and you continue with your business plan. However, right now, for companies which sold off by 70, 80, or in some cases 85 or 90%, it's not necessarily, even if you have a pricing benchmark, you can actually raise capital because there might not be a bid, even at a 20 or 30% discount. And that's why I think there's an outsized focus on cash right now. So therefore, as a CFO, what you do, you just actually, you manage cash. So, and then at the end of the day, if your cash runway is lower than 18 months, you become automatic short.
Got a good question here, sort of forward-looking. Where do you see the biggest opportunities in the next 12 months? Maybe Tom and Sander, you'd like to...
Oh, crystal ball gazing, okay.
Go for that.
Well, I mean, I think Sander picked up on it. You have, and Jorgi just mentioned it, in terms of the number of opportunities on the public markets. I mean, we have companies that are trading with zero equity value, trading at or near cash. That you're comparing, and we have the flexibility of investing in public and private. And so, when you've got one option that is trading close to cash versus a private company which could have a expensive equity value, then the sort of maths becomes easier on that point. So, it is that I expect a lot more of those vipes, if you like, into public equity. So that's certainly getting interested. Certainly from our perspective, one interesting theme we're seeing is the emergence of private equity. Sofinova recently announced a sort of minority deal with Apollo. Apollo, a huge asset manager. They've invested a minority shareholding in Sofinova. Gives us great access to their investor base. But there's an undeniable interest from a private equity standpoint. Maybe they're just seeing the valuations as well and thinking, I mean, obviously they are financial investors like everyone, but their ability to look at life sciences now is perhaps something that could be quite transformative. So I see a lot of interest there. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm coming from honest. It's hard to be thematic when everything looks very interesting at these prices. But I've always maintained. We spoke about the panel just last about the impact of manufacturing. These are very complex therapies that we're seeing, and manufacturing used to be, a second thought to a sort of drug company. Now it's becoming front and center. When clinical trials can be 12 to 15 to 20 patients, the impact and importance of manufacturing becomes critical. So that's an area of interest for me. But mainly the attraction of what value you can see on the public markets, the emergence of private equity are two themes to look out for.
Yeah. How do we think about macroeconomic factors in play right now? The long development cycle of biotech assets and high inflation, and the impact that has on, I think we can see the impact that has on valuation pretty directly in the public markets, right? That those distant cash flows are clearly worth much less in a higher interest rate environment, and it is clearly, offering investors some really interesting value entry points.
Yes, I think that is mathematically true, but I do think in this macro environment, our industry is somewhat shielded from some of those things we're seeing. It's not like pharma selling fewer pills in times of crises. It's not like they don't need to replenish certain products going off patent at an early enough stage. They're sitting on like the top 20, I think, on $500 billion of cash earmarked for acquisitions. So I think that makes our industry pretty unique compared to some other industries, that I do expect that to some extent things will continue. Inflation, of course, is a factor in discounting future cash flows, but pharma, for instance, has very low leverage, and so they're not much impacted by higher interest rates, and they can reprice their drugs with inflation, I think, on an annual basis. So I think overall, if you compare our industry, and also, I mean, energy costs don't play a major role in terms of the industry not being very energy consuming. So I think we're in a relatively good spot, even with the current macro environment.
I mean, you touched on M&A there, and certainly if you talk to my M&A colleagues in the US, I think every large cap pharma, medtech, diagnostics company is running their slide rule over any potential target they've ever looked at and more. But not much is printed yet, right? I mean, what's your sort of temperature check on the life sciences M&A market?
Well, we have to be optimists, right? So I think there will be an increase in the number of acquisitions, but I do expect it to be more the typical product-centered bolt-on type of acquisitions, up to maybe $2 billion. Although from some of the statements that, for instance, Pfizer recently made, that they want to, in the next 5 years, buy 25 billion of revenues, that would make you think that they are really looking at big late-stage acquisitions. So it's maybe a bit too early to tell, but we do expect, and also from ongoing discussions across our portfolio, I do expect that there will be product-centered, M&A.
Right.
Right.
And you're the banker. I'd have thought there'd be some pressure on the sell side here in terms of perhaps the shortage of M&A is less to do with the buying appetite and more to do with the fact that a lot of these life science companies are looking back their 12-month VWAP and going, well, I'm not selling at this price.
Right.
So I mean, until that sort of financial logic percolates down that actually this is the new reality, this is the new normal, then maybe you'll see the M&A pick up.
Yeah, and I think there was a bit of this expectation that pharma would come and save the industry. Having been on both sides and now having the discussion on this side, I think there's a misconception that because people make a lot of money with COVID, for example, that now they're going to spend that money. And I think claims from pharma companies saying that in the next 10 years I'm going to spend 10, 15, 20, 200. I think you see that all the time. That's also what their earning calls need to include when they have the cash position that they have, right? I think probably my understanding is the BD teams on that side probably have never been busier because there are so many opportunities. But I would not expect that they just start buying stuff, right? I think there's a very clear perspective on the 10 or 20 assets that they need, where they fit. And it's a question of waiting to see what we guys on the biotech side do, right? Because maybe we don't get financed. Maybe then a much better licensing deal can be done rather than buying you outright. So I think they keep close contact, but they're going to be very selective, as they've always been. It's not because they have 330 billion that they're going to do things differently, in my perspective.
Right. I mean, it reminds me actually of the comments that the Sanofi CFO made about the Ablinks acquisition, saying, we're going to finance this with quite a lot of debt. The debt's going to be quite cheap. And by the way, it's going to be EPS neutral or accretive immediately. So don't worry about your EPS, guys, which is, talking about cost of debt and EPS is just a very foreign world to most biopharma execs, right?
Absolutely.
Georges, maybe there's one other question here. We touched on sort of other financing options, and Lisa sort of underscored the importance of creating optionality and looking at all the options. I guess now in a less certain public equity environment, there are a whole host of other financing options coming to the fore, whether it's licensing, partnership, maybe as the first step into M&A, venture debt, convertible bonds, royalty finance. I mean, in your role, how do you sort of think about that smorgasbord of different options and some of the pros and cons?
I think for the companies, for the CFOs, the CEOs, and the board, I think it's great that we start seeing all this variety. Forgot to mention underwritten confidentials, registered directs. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to all cross potential investors and really create momentum very, very quickly. So I think at the end of the day, it's data, right? I mean, if you don't produce the data, nobody is going to... There has been a few cases recently where people have been in the US wall crossed just before data read out. And of course, you're looking at blinded data. and then the data is not exactly what you thought it was.
Right.
But I think those are few and far between. I think for us, it just creates especially if you're in the US, a big plethora of options. Right. Ultimately, I don't think that we will do anything if we don't have proper data, right?
Right.
So I think back to Tom's point is we're always looking at our 24-month cash picture. That's all that matters now.
Yep.
So as long as we put that or take care of that, perhaps with a couple of licensing deals or an ATM facility or something like that, we're not in a rush, and we will wait for data to come. I think that's what most people will do.
Perfect. We're just coming into the final few minutes, so can I ask each of you for 15 to 20 seconds to give a positive outlook, a view, a prediction, a positive view on 2023. And if you haven't got anything positive to say, that's fine. Don't say anything. George, you start.
I think we're going to look back at this time and see one of the best periods in terms of the vintage. I think there's
you can stop there.
I think the selectivity will continue, but ultimately the winners will emerge. Yeah. And then especially we see it in the T-cell receptor space, for example, antibody space. Now plenty of companies actually did extremely well recently.
Yeah. Tom?
When you're at rock bottom, the only way's up.
Exactly.
That's half positive. Sander?
Well, I'm old enough to have seen several of these crises or market downturns or whatever you would call them, from the dot-com to the credit crunch and to now. And I think if I look at the industry today, it's in much better shape than it was before in terms of, the science at the companies, experience management, especially in Europe, which used to be an issue that we didn't have sufficient experienced entrepreneurs and managers, but certainly also the capital available. If I look today at the number of VCs and the funds that they still manage and also other sources of funds, I think we're really in much better shape. So as the market now the public market seems to have bottomed out, fingers crossed, I think from here, indeed, the only way is up. And I do agree, and this is also what we project to our investors, that these will be really good vintages.
Yep. Fantastic. Lisa?
So we had a lot of finance comments. I'll say, I think it's actually going to be really good for patients, because I think the quality, the kind of retreat to quality in companies and investors is going to focus more money on the most promising innovation and teams that can actually deliver it to the market. So I think from a patient perspective, it could be really good.
And just on my side, I think the closing remark is, we're working on M&A projects, we're working on public market equity deals, we're working on take privates, we're working on 2 venture debt assignments. So I think it's really important to work with a banker that can offer you the full product set. And I have business cards. So thank you.
That's positive, is it? You've got business cards.
Well, I thought it was all positive, wasn't it? So look, thank you so much to all my panelists. You've made my job extremely easy and a great deal of fun this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time, and I'm sure the whole audience will want to show their appreciation.
Great to hear that we are back to some level of normality, with deals, chasing capital, plenty of opportunities, plenty of quality companies out there in the healthcare sector for the investors to invest in, and plenty of opportunities and reasons to be cheerful, including, I was pleased to hear that we haven't recently had any major accountancy scandals in the sector. So the only way indeed is up. Thank you, the Consilium team. Okay, so it is now time for our fireside chat. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our 2 guests. Amber's already given them an introduction. I'm pleased to welcome Justin Stebbing, who is here live on a screen. Hi, Justin. Can we do a sound check you can hear?
Hi, Mary Jane. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you absolutely perfectly.
I'm sorry, I'm on a screen calling from Boston.
No, don't worry at all. And Hannah Kuchler, and as Justin's just said, he's here in the US. So first of all, thanks for Hannah for jumping up on the stage. First of all, I'm going to introduce Justin, and then I will come on to Hannah. And apologies, I have to read this, as there is way too much incredible information to memorize, and I think these two legends deserve a little bit of background on why we've invited them both here today. I've actually already condensed as much information as I possibly can, but I am going to talk for a little while. So Professor Justin Stebbing is Editor-in-Chief of Nature's Cancer Journal Oncogene, and he is a visiting Professor of Cancer Medicine and Oncology at Imperial College London. During his career, as well as publishing more than 700 peer-reviewed papers in journals such as The Lancet and the NEJM, he has written for national newspapers and presented new cancer therapy data at major international congresses. He's an honorary professor at Imperial College London, and his work has concentrated on new druggable target discovery. The charity Action Against Cancer has supported his work. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Pathologists, and sits on the advisory boards of a number of international cancer committees, chairing several advisory boards within companies including Benevolent AI, who we heard from earlier. Interestingly, and amongst other things, I find it fascinating, he has published a large body of work on harnessing the immune system to treat cancer using HIV as a model. And of course, like many, and I was pleased earlier on one of the panels to hear that the COVID era is over, he turned his skills to help during the COVID crisis, and at the start of the pandemic, published data in The Lancet, and using AI, that we heard about the importance of that earlier, found a potential new drug to treat coronavirus. He then led many of the international studies leading to the drug's FDA approval in November 2020, and baricitinib was one of the best risk-reward profiles for hospitalized patients with COVID-19 pneumonia, and has already saved more than thousands of lives. Justin also works, and it's important for this audience to know, as a consultant for Lansdowne and Vitruvian Partners, two large fund managers who have positions in companies represented by clients of ours at Consilium, and also companies in this room. Finally, I think it's important for you to know that he also taught my two daughters how to skim stones on the sea. So he is a man who not only wears many hats, as Amber said earlier, but he has also many publicised and unpublicized talents. Now, turning to Hannah. As everybody here in the room will know, Hannah is Global Pharma Correspondent at the FT, now based, thankfully, here in London. She is no typical reporter, though. She herself, Justin, also studied in Oxford and gained a first in history. Having been at the FT for almost 11 years now, she is an Emmy-nominated journalist and famed for having reported during her career already from 3 continents and covered everything from Wall Street to British politics. I have to read her biography as well, I'm afraid, because these two people are such legends, as I mentioned before. Even within the Consilium team, we discussed last week that even Hannah was worthy of being interviewed herself. She endured the COVID era, which involved relentless reporting. I know people here read the FT, relentless reporting from the FT whilst the publication tracked the race for a vaccine, including her interview with Fauci. Prior to covering healthcare, she was in the Silicon Valley herself, also covering tech companies like Facebook, and she has been interviewed on places like CNBC, NBC, and Sky News. So, sorry for the long introduction, but I think you'll agree these two friends of ours are a good match, and I should stop reading their biographies, but hand over to Hannah, please, to chat to Justin. And thank you both very much for sparing your time and being with us here today.
Well, thank you, MJ. I shan't speak for Justin, but I feel thoroughly embarrassed.
I do as well.
Okay, we're in the same place.
You just want that over much more quickly, don't you, Hannah?
I do, though I'm jealous because I can't skim stones, so.
You haven't been taught yet.
No, I'm looking forward to my lesson. All right. Well, Justin, obviously, you're beaming in from Boston, so you haven't been here all day, but I bet you could guess that a lot of the discussion has been about the tricky year that has been for biotech so far. And a lot of the focus has been on what the markets do next. But this fireside, we hope, is a chance to pull back and look at the science, where it's going, what opportunities it will bring to patients and investors. And also, now I'm double mic'd. Okay, is that better? Hey.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm really pleased to be joined by you today because you have so many hats, as MJ said, most obviously as a research scientist, a clinician, and an advisor to investors. I want us to go way back to the start because one of the things that MJ said was, you have worked with cancer in the immune system kind of since the beginning of your career. Obviously now this is very well-known and well-deployed science. What made you interested in it back then?
I was always interested in, if you like, the end of chemotherapy. Chemotherapy, if you like, was first used in the Third Battle of Ypres in the First World War, when the Germans used mustard gas the first day, then the British used it the next, and then the story of Bowie Harbour with the USS John Harvey in the Second World War in 1943 led to mustard gas being taken to Yale and used to treat someone with a lymphosarcoma. And then we noticed that after kidney transplants performed at Harvard, individuals developed lymphomas, but if you remove their immunosuppression, the lymphoma went away, so did the transplant. And then after I left Oxford, I did my residency at Johns Hopkins, where I saw really deprived individuals with end-stage HIV, terrible cancers. But if you made the HIV better, the cancer again got better. But our efforts to stimulate the immune system were poor originally. And if you look at the immunotherapies that are available to us, there's still no agonist drugs. There's no drugs that stimulate the immune system. Sure, the PD-1s and the PD-L1s, they inhibit the inhibition of the immune system. And I'm beaming in from Boston because I've been at the Society for the Immunotherapy Treatment of Cancer, and this was a meeting that 5 years ago had a couple of hundred people there, and now it's got 10,000.
Wow.
And the mission is very clear. It's to move the rhetoric from turning cancer into a chronic disease, even if it's metastasized, to one where it's curable. And that's really the direction of travel. Obviously, it's very passé to say, and a bit unoriginal to say we want you to live with it, akin to diabetes or high blood pressure. But if you look at the detail of what the speakers here have been saying, whether it's basic science or industry, and it's very clear that people are now looking at metastatic cancers as curable. If you like, in the same way that HIV is functionally curable. If I was diagnosed as being HIV positive today, I would expect to have a normal life expectancy. But there's been a lot of disappointments. The second generation immunotherapies all failed, didn't they? If you look at the story of the IDO inhibitors, TIM3, LAG3, GIDA, TIGIT, they've all suffered. And it's easy to say in retrospect by phase 3 trials that were driven off phase 2 trials that were far too small and done far too quickly. But there's some really, really hopeful new signs out there. But it's only because we're also able to look at cancer differently. We've got better basic science. I went to one presentation on tumor heterogeneity where they were looking at scans from the same patients. And what we were seeing was that even in responding patients, some lesions progress, some are stable, whereas others respond. That even within an individual, the way tumor masses respond at a radiologic level is completely different. So something as simple as looking at someone's cancer on a scan, which we take for granted when you get a CT report, is something where we're starting to look at it differently. Progression is not the same. You can often, with these drugs, even in progressing people, treat through that, and then they respond. And responses aren't the same as well. I'll stop there.
So it sounds like we've been through sort of several generations where we're actually seeing kind of a breakthrough in understanding that it's actually even more complicated and even more personalized than we think. How confident are you that we will get to this stage where we start to consider living with cancer in the same way living with HIV? And what breakthroughs will we need to see along the way?
Well, in some ways you can live with cancer already. The median survival of breast cancer with bone-only metastases, not a disease that responds to immunotherapy, is over 10 years. So if a 70-year-old woman's diagnosed with it, she probably won't die of it. But when you think about the aggressive killing cancers, glioblastoma, pancreatic cancer, triple-negative breast cancer, microsatellite stable colorectal cancer, diseases traditionally that don't respond to immunotherapy, we're really starting to see green shoots. Some of the drugs in development, the enhanced CTLA-4s in particular, look really, really promising. And what is interesting as well is we're struggling to find biomarkers of response. Obviously, regulators like to talk about that, and we like to think about it. But we still can't work out, even using things like rapid whole genome sequencing, why some people respond and why some people don't. So you go to a deeper level, you look at things like copy number variation or single cell sequencing, RNA sequencing, and we're really, really struggling to work out why some people respond and why some people don't. And we traditionally thought of tumors as hot and cold. I don't think of them like that. I think of them as warm or hot. And we just understand the warm ones less well than the hot ones. It's as simple as that, because all tumors have a massively dysregulated genome. They're on the edge of genomic instability, which is why chemotherapy works, because it pushes them off the cliff. But some of the molecules we're now seeing out there are really, really, really impressive. They're giving me too moments. Like, did the speaker really just say that that patient with a fourth line angiosarcoma just responded to an enhanced CTLA-4? That was Bree Wilkie's talk, for example, from the University of Colorado. Is that really the case? And, you know, I almost double checking myself, and that is the case. And you wonder whether the regulators will support smaller, quicker, faster trials like they always say they will. But the reality is I'm not sure that they do.
Do you see any difference between the regulators on that, or are they all a little bit cautious? I mean, just now you said one of the problems with previous generation was maybe heading too fast into some trials.
I think they designed big phase 3 studies of poorly designed phase 2 studies, is what I would clarify that by saying. I think that the regulators have sometimes an obsession with things they shouldn't have an obsession with. For example, finding the lowest dose, an obsession with p-values as opposed to the totality of evidence. So, for example, we're talking about immunotherapy. So in cancer, you like to move the median, the middle point. So if you're doing a study of chemotherapy in pancreatic cancer, if everyone's going to live for 6 months and you make everyone live for 7 months, that drug will be approved because it shifts the median. But if you have a few exceptional responders, the problem with that is the median of 2,222 a million is still 2. And so I think there needs to be a mindset amongst the regulators as well. But the regulators, as we've seen in neurology with everything from Biogen to Amylyx and other drugs, can be ferociously unpredictable. So you also get the feeling that while the scientists and the academics and the clinicians agree with things, sometimes you feel that they don't have a partner with the regulators.
So you think that within the scientific community, this move that you talked about from sort of cancer as, the ambition being cancer as chronic to cancer as a cure, do you think that there's a consensus there?
I think there's a consensus amongst academics and clinical trial leaders. I don't think there's a consensus amongst regulators who just say things like, we need to see 2 well-powered phase 3 randomized controlled trials.
Yeah.
And we've just, for example, and they might say that, but back to the neurology point, obviously Roche's 2 phase 3 trials failed today. Aduhelm had 2 phase 3 trials, which I could never consider a success. But then the most successful recent trial in Alzheimer's, Clarity lecanemab's trial, is just 1 study. So I'm very interested to see how the regulators look at that.
And what did you think of that study?
I haven't seen the details. I know that at CTAD in San Francisco, you cannot get tickets anymore. It's completely sold out. And I want to see the safety. They've got 1,800 people. They had to increase the powering. And I don't understand enough about neurology or Alzheimer's to really understand if it helps people, but I'm not sure that anyone does.
Yes, that's true. That's why they're all queuing up like it's Coachella.
Exactly.
We've got one question in from the audience, and a reminder to the audience, you can ask questions on Slido online, which is relevant to what we were just talking about, and I think it was in response to your example of finding it tricky to shift the median. So how do you run a clinical trial for the exceptional responders?
So you can do things like, there's other statistical analyses. You can do adaptive designs. You can look at landmark analyses, for example, 6 months or 12 months PFS. And you can shift the analysis to overall survival as well, where exceptional responders and the medians should be able to pick it up. But it's difficult in answer to your question, particularly if there's no biomarker of response. I mentioned one drug category, the FC-enhanced anti-CTLA-4s, where we were seeing responses in end-line serous ovarian cancer, sarcomas. I could go on and on. But despite those drugs being around for over a decade, there's still no biomarker of response, for example. And I'm not sure we're going to find one. So the truth is, I don't really know, if I'm being utterly candid with you, but there needs to be a redesign of the way we think about things as well, and if necessarily, not use medians and take into account exceptional responders.
Yeah, interesting. And obviously one of the other sort of big trends in development in cancer is pushing towards better early detection with things like liquid biopsy. What do you think the prospects are there?
That's a really great question. I'd say 3 things about that. Number one, we really, really need to pick up stage 1 tumors. Most cancers are curable surgically if detected early enough, despite the fact I think of cancer as a systemic disease that affects the whole body. Nearly all cancers are curable if you detect them early enough, number one. I find these data sets I've seen from GRAIL and others very difficult because they're picking up a lot of stage 3 and 4 tumors. The false positive rate is high, so is the false negative rate. We're just not there yet. That's the first thing. The second thing is our ability to detect minimal residual disease in a lot of cancer types, such as colon or bladder or lung, has really come on leaps and bounds. So you can compare tumor-informed tests that utilize the patient's original cancer to personalize that, or off-the-shelf tumor-uninformed tests. So obviously we're going to see Guardant's data from the Eclipse trial at the end of the year. We'll see Freenome, further GRAIL studies next year. But I think that if we understand minimal residual disease better, we'll be able to make a cancer diagnostic for the blood better. And then the third thing comes back to the scientific points I was mentioning earlier. Methylation, for example, is one of the earliest changes in cancer. I think that most people agree with that. So if you can identify the earliest methylated genes in cancer and then look for blood tests for those, we're really going to start to get somewhere. So I think we're going to see huge developments here. But I'm very conscious of the false positive rate. There are some, I've had patients in clinic get approved tests online for things like lung cancer, and the tests come up positive. And I perform PET scans, refer them for bronchoscopies, and nothing can be found. And you've just destroyed that patient's quality of life for the next few months.
Yeah, I must say, actually, personally, my dad got one of those letters from the NHS saying, sign up to GRAIL, and he very proudly told me I signed up, and I was like, oh, I hope it's okay. I hope there's not a false positive.
Exactly. It's difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, I, as a doctor seeing patients in the clinic now, I still don't know what to do if I see Mrs. Smith with some kind of blood test that shows she's likely to have cancer, and I've scanned her from top to bottom and I can't find anything. I don't know when to see her again, what to say, when to get another blood test, and I'm not sure that anyone does.
Yeah.
And anyone that has a strong opinion about that, I think, is wrong.
All right, that's a message to our audience. We're getting loads of questions in already. So one is, you've talked a lot about therapeutics. What is your view of the likelihood of success of prophylactics such as vaccines?
Again, we're going to see, I'm very interested to see the phase 2 data from Moderna by the end of the year. In stage 3 melanoma, about 150 patients randomized to Pembro versus Pembro plus their cancer vaccine. Every successful drug starts off life in cancer patients. So we first of all need to see cancer vaccine developments in cancer patients before we can think about them as a preventative. But maybe because of the amount of capital companies like Moderna and BioNTech have developed because of COVID, obviously, having billions of dollars in the bank, maybe that will facilitate them to develop anti-cancer drugs. So they'll use the benefits they obtained from COVID to cure other diseases. I love cancer vaccines. I don't know whether it should be personalized to an individual or off the shelf. It can't be personalized if you're using it as a prophylactic, can it? Because there's no cancer to start with. But I love the thought of cancer vaccines preventing cancer as we get older, because age is the biggest risk factor of cancer, bigger than smoking or obesity. But some of the things, again, we're learning from basic science. Like I went to a presentation that maybe T cells, for example, which we think of as being very tumor specific, and Treg cells in the tumor are bad news, and they damp down the immune system, and CD8 positive cytotoxic T lymphocytes are good news. And then I went to a presentation that T cells on one location in the body can secrete things, interferons and so forth, affecting cancer at a totally different location, for example. I mean, this is staggering that maybe you can stimulate with the cancer vaccine T cells in one arm, and the local immune system there is secreting things, not necessarily traveling somewhere or going somewhere to influence cancer at a distant site.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, amazing. One other question from the audience is, what's the future for small molecule cancer treatments? Is immuno-oncology the only way forward for pharmaceutical treatment of advanced cancers?
I've always thought it's going to be a combination approach, and I love small molecules. Look, I always think of cancer like the London Underground tube map, and you're trying to work out if embankment's not working, or Charing Cross, Victoria, and Waterloo, and if you've got a missile for all of those. And the more targeted missiles you've got, the better. I'm a little bit down in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the patent reforms that you've had CEOs like AbbVie's CEO sort of saying on their conference calls that they're throwing in the towel on small molecules. But I think small molecules are here to stay. The great thing about small molecules is, unlike antibodies, they're much better at targeting intracellular targets, and there's many more intracellular targets compared to targets on the surface of a cancer. You just need to look at the successes of drugs such as ibrutinib or Tagrisso, huge drugs because they work so well. But I think it's going to be a combination approach ultimately.
Yes, I'm not sure if I love your tube.
But one of the difficulties from the combination approach is there's still a regulatory reluctance to study two investigational agents together in one study.
Yeah.
Even if you study the separate components, number one. And number two, there's a biopharma reluctance to team up and collaborate with investigational drugs in development. It's all very well having the keynote studies with Merck giving away Keytruda for free. But that was once Keytruda was approved. They certainly never did that pre-approval.
Yeah, it does sound like a concern that there's quite a lot of stumbling blocks from the regulators not kind of being prepared to consider enough options. What about, though,
But also, you never find two biopharma companies with investigational drugs in development working together in a single trial with agents together. You don't find that either. So it's not just about the regulators.
Yeah, no, there's obviously a structural issue of competition there. Yeah, I can see that.
Right.
And what about, though, getting the challenges of getting, some of the breakthroughs we've been talking about to patients? Do you think that that's getting easier or harder?
New drugs are obviously very expensive. Just, look at Bluebird's recent gene therapy for hemophilia, $4.3 million, which ICER, the Institute for Cost-Effective Research, the NICE equivalent in America, said was fine. But I'm pretty positive about biosimilars. I've led a lot of international biosimilar studies with CTP6, which was Celltrion's Hazuma. And the great thing about biosimilars is you make that drug cheaper, and then you can spend the additional money on other drugs. I'm positive about it. Keytruda, which we just talked about, is going to go off patent, depending on how you count it, in 2028. And again, that creates a huge opportunity for newer innovative drugs to come along. But you have to have expensive drugs, because otherwise there's no real incentive for biopharmaceutical companies to fund billions of dollars into R&D. That's just the reality. I don't think there's any getting around that.
Yeah, and what you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and do you think that that's going to have a big impact, or is it maybe the pharma CEOs like AbbVie throwing their toys out of the pram?
I think, look, we've seen ever since Hillary Clinton's tweet, you know, which was, I think, I forget when it was, 2015,
Yeah,
16.
15.
You know, 15. We've seen just continued rhetoric on drug pricing, whether it's macro drug pricing and GDP of America versus Europe, or micro drug pricing and insulin costs. I just think, you know, there will just be this constant rhetoric. Biden recently said, you know, we're beating pharma. I don't think that's helpful, because
beating pharma and beating cancer at the same time.
Right. I don't think it's helpful rhetoric, because, you know, you have Roche today failing in 2 Alzheimer's studies. It's now nearly $100,000 for a patient in a clinical trial. That pharmaceutical company needs to pay the CRO huge sums of money. And if they're not incentivized to do that, then the system collapses, but I still think they are.
And you talked about your practice. Your suspension of practice recently expired. The press covered this as the original suspension through the lens of hubris, saying you'd been nicknamed God and given futile treatment without disclosing all the risks to terminally ill cancer patients. What's your side of the story?
I don't really want to go back in time. I think you know the news. You can have a look at the cover of the last BMJ yourself, where they talk about the GMC in the last week. I'm sure you've seen that, Hannah. I'm not sure everyone in the audience has. It was a difficult time for me. I just want to move forward.
Do you think that, I mean, did you learn any lessons, and do you think there's lessons for the GMC?
You always learn lessons in these things, but just, I'm sorry to be candid, I just don't really want to talk about it.
Okay.
You can read the last BMJ if you want further insights, where thankfully I'm not mentioned.
All right, there's some reading for the drinks party. You started to look for COVID drugs, as MJ said, straight away in January 2020. What was the approach with Benevolent AI, and kind of how much of it was AI and how much of it was more sort of traditional scientific work?
Well, what we know so far, if you take radiology, looking at mammograms, is that human plus AI is far better than human or AI alone. And obviously in January 2020, we were all getting a bit worried. Everything's easy to say in retrospect. And I sat down with Benevolent AI. We wanted to find an existing drug, so we knew the safety profile, that would have both anti-cytokine effects, because we knew that the cytokine storm at that point was deleterious to people, and antiviral effects. So it was pretty predictable from a human point of view that when you mine the literature, that a rheumatoid arthritis drug is going to have anti-cytokine effects. But what no human could have predicted was that it could also, that baricitinib would have antiviral effects via inhibition of 2 kinases, AAK and GAK, that the virus needed to jump from cell to cell. That was entirely unpredictable, and that a human with all the time in the world could never have come up with that. And when we submitted it to the Lancet, and Richard Horton, the editor, took it in under 3 minutes, and that paper's got over 1,500 citations already, and it's just a letter, and then we published some others, that I didn't believe that we would validate it in organoid models in the laboratory. And then once we did that, I didn't believe that the clinical trials would show a bigger mortality benefit from that, and that it would be safer than steroids, than any other drug for people. And it's cheap, useful for democratizing or low and middle income countries, no drug-to-drug interactions, very few side effects. And I thought that it might have a big clot problem, because there was a slight hint of a clot problem in the rheumatoid arthritis phase 3 trials. And obviously COVID caused clots, so I thought maybe 2 + 2 would equal 5. We didn't find any of that. I was amazed, Lilly were amazed. And I think all the investigators on the trials were amazed. And it just turned into be a tremendous development. And it just shows the power of AI. And it shows how useful it can be, particularly in speeding up drug development in times of crisis.
And do you think it will work in the same way outside of the context of a crisis? I suppose one thing that strikes me is that repurposing drugs in that position, going to Lilly saying, please repurpose this, they were much more likely to do it than in other times. And that sometimes the IP situation means it's not really in anyone's interest to repurpose it.
Yeah, I think, part of the issue with COVID is it affected everyone so much, whether it affected them socially, economically, or physically and psychologically. And that there was a real impetus. It was just, when you worked in it, my lab at Imperial was closed. Lilly's labs were open, but they needed special permission. One lab I worked with the Karolinska, was open. Some Singapore labs I worked with were open, half. But there was such a sense of urgency. No one was looking at IPs, walls were coming down. People just wanted to help people. That was the only agenda. So if you look at, for example, lessons you could apply in cancer, the problem is that people are much more relaxed about the timeline. People don't feel it needs to be done yesterday, whereas COVID gave you that sense of urgency. So it's not going to be as easy, but I still think it's going to be possible.
And what do you think are the prospects for a sort of truly, completely AI designed drug from scratch?
Yeah. So Benevolent has that in the pipeline with its ulcerative colitis drug. Other companies have it. The FT reported on Veris's ALS drug, for example. We need to see if they work, but I think the likelihood of them working is much higher, and now we have a real case study to prove that.
Yeah.
One that I was very, very cynical about. I said to Joanna Shields, the CEO of Benevolent AI, I'm really not sure the phase 3 trials are going to work. And they did.
Mm. And you're now working with another AI company, right? Is it Zephyr AI?
Yeah, Zephyr AI. It's a very different model. So what that's looking at is they're looking at linking genomic data to patient notes to understand off-target effects of existing drugs and the way, again, that they can be used. For example, I mentioned Tagrisso earlier, whether that could be used in EGFR mutation negative individuals to benefit them, and who might that help in, and that's looking at gene regulatory networks.
Okay, so it's taking a different approach. And what do you think about that? It seems like there's several different types of AI drug discovery companies. What do you think about the companies that are sort of using AI to better understand the targets?
Yeah, I mean, Benevolent AI's genesis is really target identification. I love it. I think it's great, but ultimately, research is one thing, development is another. The cost of clinical trials is enormous. And despite all the developments in AI, no one's ever designed a shorter phase 3 studies. Yes, the phase 3 trials in COVID occurred quickly, but that's because there were so many events that occurred quickly. So when you're looking at an outcomes-driven trial, there's no AI program that's going to speed it up. But if you're much more confident about the input drug working, then perhaps it's worth the capital outlay.
Yeah. So you also advise investment firms, and as I said, we've done a lot of hand-wringing about the biotech sell-off, although the last panel ended with a instruction that everyone had to be positive. So, but do you think, I mean, from your position as a scientist, does the biotech sell-off change anything for you? And does it make it more difficult in any way?
I think it does. I think that makes it difficult in a number of ways. Number one, I'm not entirely sure that the public markets are a source of funding for biotech companies anymore.
Ever?
Number
or
two,
at the moment?
For the foreseeable future. Number two, sometimes global collaboration is becoming harder. For example, collaborators I have in China, the world could become a frostier place. I think that biotech is the only sector we consistently see negative enterprise value companies, as everyone knows. Now, you do occasionally see them in other sectors, but they're few and far between. You don't have 220 companies in other sectors with a negative EV, and that's because clinical development and the cost of clinical trials means that biotech burn through so much capital. And in the old days, you'd have a target like PD-1, PD-L1, CDK4/6, BTK, and so on, and there'd be 20 drugs in development and 50 trials. But going forwards, I think we're going to see 10 drugs in development and 20 trials. And then if a trial fails, the company's not going to be saying, okay, let's now run a trial in that subgroup that we can see that it worked in, such as, you know, women over the age of 70. We'll just look at those for want of a better subgroup. That's not going to be one. It's going to be some individual biomarker, isn't it? But let's look at those. Now they're just going to have to kill the drug. So things are going to change.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's been a lot of talk about the idea of investors requiring fiscal discipline as actually a good thing, but actually it could take some important drugs off the table.
No question about that. And you wonder that if Keytruda had been developed by a small biotech or a smaller biotech, whether it would have ever seen the light of day. Merck's phase 1 study was 1,000 patients large. I mean,
yeah.
It's pretty big, right?
Yeah, that's a very big phase 1. Okay, I'm going to end with a question from the audience, which is, do you think a cure for cancer is possible in the next generation?
Yes, is the answer to that. But you can't do that without advances in how we understand and control aging and make people age better.
Okay, so this is a link into some of the work that's being done on longevity.
Exactly. I think that, I was about to say, I think that's an important sleeper, if you'll excuse the senescence pun.
Yes, I'm very interested, actually. Now, I said that was going to be the last question, but I'm going to go and get my own because you just brought up something interesting. I'm very interested in, you know, the attention that has been given to longevity so far has been about these big name tech billionaires putting in loads of money. You know, how do you think it kind of ends up crossing into, you know, a mainstream part of the industry?
I think it's been the realm of tech billionaires because they just have a very long horizon and they don't need an instant return, unlike investors today with various things that they don't even need a 5 or 10-year return. But I still think we need, despite developments from understanding methylation and the Horvath clock to metabolism, I still think we need outcomes-driven clinical trials to show that certain approaches can influence aging, the quality of aging, the way we age, and diseases that we get on the way. And we're still a long way from those, but they will come.
And many enthusiasts in this area do intermittent fasting, or they take metformin, or things like that. Do you do any of those?
No, but I tell some people to do it. So I certainly
do as I say, not as I do.
With patients, exactly. Do as I say, not as I do. Certainly, a lot of the data on intermittent fasting in good journals, and some of the data on metformin are very, very provocative in a positive way.
Okay.
But we're not there yet.
Wow, thank you, Justin, very much for talking to us. And now everyone can go on a fast and save Consilium some money on the canapé bill.
Thanks.
Well, thank you both very much for that. Thank goodness the tech worked. As I said previously, it's a rare occasion that you find a mix of skills as rich as Justin's is possibly gone. And so I hope everybody found it interesting. Hannah, thank you very much. As always, you're amazing. Always at the end of this conference, I feel in a privileged position to be working within the healthcare sector. We in this room are all largely focused on creating returns for shareholders, at the same time on making an impact for patients, and that's come up quite a bit today. The sector requires the other kind of patients as well, though, doesn't it, as we all know? And the market has been bleak, but there are more than green shoots out there, and there is certainly plenty of cash for the right companies with the right assets and the right teams. And as we heard from Lyndon on the first panel, there is plenty of cash out there. Just don't forget to come to see her in Europe, and certainly don't go to the US, not come to Europe, and then just come to Europe when something's gone wrong. So what have we learned today? I've got terrible scribble all over the place, so bear with me. We've learned that bubbles should not be called bubbles. They should be called hot areas, that cash is still king, even if you're public. Don't just take it for granted you can raise just because you're listed. Also king is creativity and prioritization, that the sector is strong, but it has lots and lots of hot areas, including gene therapy, liquid biopsy, CNS, neurodegeneration. But there are a lot of companies out there. So yes, it is, to Tracy's analogy, like we do feel like children in a sweet shop. But differentiation is key, and working in the space that we work in at Consilium, I think that's music to our ears. Everybody needs their very differentiated story. I loved Lachlan's view on the UK, that the scene has changed here in the past 10 years, and that the UK is now in pole position. I also really like Lisa's point, actually, that investors want to hear about track record of delivery. They need good management judgment, and that this, as well as the science, products, and data. And I thought the point from Justin about watch out for those false positives, that's something for us all to take home tonight. Definitely read last week's BMJ, and wouldn't it be good if the need for speed was applied to cancer treatments for everybody in this room and everybody that we know. At Consilium, as Amber mentioned before, we're in our 10th financial year, and we have had a lot of recent successes to celebrate here, and are very proud to work with a broad spectrum of international clients, including some of the most innovative and highest quality in the world. But that does draw our conference to a close. I'd like to say a massive thank you, of course, to all of our speakers, the sponsors, but huge thanks to our terrific home team who have worked extremely hard over not just the past hours, days, weeks, but months to put this great event together. There are drinks going to be served out there now. Feel free, contrary to what Hannah said, to eat all of the canapes and drink as much water or whatever there is served out there as you like. It's been absolutely lovely seeing everybody, and have a safe journey home.